Good afternoon. Order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 12th of May 2025. Private finance has been a significant source of finance for public investments in economic and social infrastructure, and there are a wide range of public financing models, including the most extensively used Private Finance Initiative, PFI, as everyone knows. Investment in new infrastructure has been identified by the government as central to its mission to grow the economy, and it has indicated that it plans to deliver this investment by working in partnership with the private sector. However, there are risks involved with this approach. So today we're fortunate enough to have with us two panel witnesses with a huge wealth of knowledge and experience in the field of infrastructure finance and public sector partnerships ahead of questioning of government officials later this afternoon. So we hope to hear from them what they think are the costs, benefits, risks, opportunities associated with the government's plans for delivering infrastructure investment in conjunction with the private sector. And we have, as I say, two very experienced and knowledgeable witnesses, so I will now start by introducing them. Darryl Murphy on my left, the Managing Director of Aviva Investors. Darryl is responsible for the origination, structuring and execution of new infrastructure debt transactions and has had over 27 years of experience in infrastructure finance. To my right is Bruce Dalgleish, partner and co-founder of P2G LLB. P2G provides PFI contract management services for complex, long-term public-private sector partnerships. And Bruce has 25 years experience in major projects, including 150 PFIs in all sectors and senior positions in investments, FM and construction. So we extend a very warm welcome and thanks to our guest members, and also to Bobby Dean, who is a member of the Treasury Select Committee. You're very welcome, Bobby. And to start us off with all of that, we have the first question from Oliver Ryan, please.
Thank you, Darryl. Thank you, Bruce, for coming today. I'll kick us off. Do you think the government are clear enough on their preferred financing structures for PPP deals?
I kick off. Good afternoon.
Come straight into it.
Sarah Murphy. I think. Let me explain how I would frame this. So we would look at things in terms of UK infrastructure in the broadest context, and we are obviously have capital to deploy. So we would then basically have to react to the models that are set forward. And if you think, well, how we define infrastructure, I would refer to your common approach of saying you've got energy, utilities, transport, digital, increasingly social infrastructure. Now, UK has a wide array of different models that are used to finance or fund and finance infrastructure, of which PPP is a very small part of. And in fact, for the last number of years, it's been extremely small because it's only really been in Wales where it's been utilised in the last sort of 5 years or so. So from that basis, what we look to is there clarity in each asset class around whether there's an opportunity for private finance. Now that's the policy decision we then have to react to. So if we take social infrastructure, meaning schools and hospitals, simple example, where PFI PPP was utilised over many years, the policy changed a number of years ago, and for the last two administrations we've really had a situation where that's been delivered through effectively through public borrowing. So in a sense, we just react to that. The clear answer, I would say, therefore, is, and I'm in danger of kind of conflating this perhaps with the next question, another question, which is, as we look forward to the National Infrastructure Strategy, all we're seeking is clarity that across all those sectors, what is the model and what is the opportunity set? And once you have that, it's not a debate on whether it's right or wrong. We can then react to the models where our capital is, for want of a better term, welcome, and other areas where actually public borrowing will be utilised.
I would absolutely agree with everything Darryl said. I think obviously June is the announcement in terms of policy. I think probably the biggest question that the industry is waiting to hear on, and what drives the model more than anything, is whether you're desirous of off-balance sheet transactions or on-balance sheet transactions. Because ultimately, government can borrow money cheaper than the private sector if it's off-balance sheet. And off-balance sheet comes with a risk profile associated with it that isn't always conducive to value for money.
Indeed. Thank you both. I think there's a lot of big politics around the PFI stuff. There certainly has been for the last 10 years, and we'll not get into some of that because you probably don't want to touch it. But just on some of the reforms that you've mentioned, do you think they're ambitious enough, and do you think they'll work in terms of making this system clearer for you and clearer for the taxpayer?
If I start again, I think if we were to be, and apologies, I'm very granular about this. If you think about it, it's only have to worry about infrastructure in a sense. So very granular about each of those subsectors. You could go through each of them, which I'm sure I'm about to see in the National Infrastructure Strategy, and see the articulation of what is required and how it will be delivered. And I think, at risk of repeating myself, that's all we're kind of looking for. And if you sit here today, it's reasonably clear to me what we'd expect to see in something like renewable energy, because the model for renewables has broadly existed for some time, use of contract for differences, etc. So you've got one small piece there. The area that probably has had the most debate, to be fair, and to picking Bruce's points, has been, is there going to be a return of the use of PPP? Because that hasn't been utilised, other than my reference to MIM in Wales. So in industry terms, that is probably an area that has had less, from what I understand, probably less certainty about how it eventualise. The other sectors, it is much clearer in terms of the models. I think all we're looking to see in other areas of the economy is what is required at what pace and what delivery model. That's a little bit more granularity if you go into detail on anything aligning, say, for example, to energy transition. So I say PPP is getting a lot of spotlight because there's been greater debate about it. I would go back to, it's a very important area, but it's a relatively, I would anticipate to see it's a very small part of a much bigger pie, which is UK infrastructure.
Do you want to add?
I think working in conjunction with the private sector is a really huge, broad spectrum. Obviously, today we're talking about the use of private finance in infrastructure, and obviously extending private sector and public sector working in partnership together covers an awful lot that doesn't necessarily involve private finance. Private finance is a choice as to whether that can increase or speed up the amount of investment in UK infrastructure, and that really, I guess, is down to a policy decision that we're all expectantly waiting for.
Thank you. And the last one from me, Chair. So you've both mentioned sort of specificity and long-term sight, if you like, make it a good market for you. If you're government now, and you've still got a whiteboard in your office and you're still looking at what you could do, what changes would you bring forward? And second question, and a slight tilt away from that, how effective do you feel government is at contract management side of PFI, PPP?
Gosh, they're sort of unconnected. They're deliberately unconnected.
They are unconnected, but if you've got 30 seconds.
No, you threw it as a sort of a curveball then. The first part, I would say, look, I refer back to what I said previously. I'm unashamedly granular about it. I've always encouraged across government that and again, I appreciate this is a very minor world for many, but for the world of infrastructure is kind of like this, and to be incredibly granular around the solution for each subsector is not one size fits all. So what I've always encouraged is to find the right models for delivery, but also fundamentally is normally policy around what is required. So that's the number one thing of advise government, which I do think generally government has got a good handle on, which is what's required. I think the private sector is frustrated by when, and moreover by how. And that needs to be produced, not just in areas which may be pertinent for PPP, but even generally where the private sector is delivering overall. To your second point, I think one has to remember that to my broader, and again I keep coming back to broad landscape, a lot of investors fall into this trap as well. So I sit along my peers and they say, I want a pipeline. Just give me a pipeline, right? The problem is, I do appreciate that government doesn't procure directly a lot of infrastructure anymore. What I mean by which, it creates the investment environment for it to happen. If you think the whole energy industry works by private sector delivery, private sector financing, only because, of course, government makes an investment climate, creates an investment climate that suits that investment. Digital infrastructure happens on its own, in effect, again with some reasonably light touch regulation. So we've seen large areas of our economy in infrastructure being delivered without procurement. Your question is very pertinent to areas where are we seeing direct procurements, as it were, is really only been in PPP to some degree. And as I say, that model has not really existed, and that will stray into the point of, look, you're into the detail of, which Bruce can go into chapter and verse on, there are good and bad examples of how that contract management, and the point being is, can we learn from that going forward? I'm not sure it's going to be needed, but if we're going to do something again, I think we're all much better at learning from the past and actually utilising it going forward. But
I think that's true. I mean, going back to your first question, I think the biggest thing probably the industry is looking for is cross-party support. Yeah, because the investment horizons for infrastructure go way beyond a single administration. So the fear, I guess, is that if there isn't cross-party support for whatever initiative that involves private finance, then ultimately policy may change, which then creates a different environment that people are working in and investing in. Going on to your second point, from my perspective, there are probably 650 different public sector bodies that are all involved in contract management of PPP. And there has been a huge amount of really good work done by what is now NISTA in terms of producing guidance. But that is a huge amount of data and a huge amount of guidance for people to try and swallow, particularly with a backdrop of not necessarily being able to afford good contract management, either at local authority level or at NHS Trust. And disaggregation, is absolutely fantastic in terms of decision making. It doesn't necessarily build you up a cohort of specialists who can manage contracts of whatever form. It doesn't have to be private finance. And I think sometimes with private finance, there is, because of the risk transfer element, potentially a misplaced assurance that risk transfer equates to risk management by the private sector, and therefore people feel assured that this is all someone else's problem, I don't need to worry about it. And actually, at the point that you get too assured, that can become a problem. Equally, if you centralise everything, that probably isn't the answer either. And somewhere in the middle might hold the right answer.
I'm going to bring Cyril in a minute, but Bruce, you sort of hit one of my inflection points, and it's this point about on or off balance sheets that you mentioned. And given that we're at 100% of GDP on our debt, there must obviously be a temptation to want to try and keep it off balance sheet. On the other hand, now that we're no longer subject to the European accounting regime, we can put it on balance sheet. And we've had evidence from New Economics Foundation who say PPP payments on government balance sheet, and in doing so we can remove remove the primary incentive that drove the failures of PFI. Placing new PFI costs on the balance sheet would subject them to the same scrutiny and spending rules as traditional public procurement, potentially fostering greater discipline and focus on value for money. So should we have them on or off balance sheet? And then I might bring the CNAG in afterwards.
Shall I have a go first, Darryl?
Yeah.
So I think rather than going straight to an answer as to what is the right answer, because I'm not sure there is a right answer, I think what you've got to stand back and say, what am I trying to achieve? What are the raison d'etre for bringing in private finance? And the danger with driving off-balance sheet solution is in order to create an off-balance sheet transaction, you need a certain amount of risk transfer. And that risk transfer doesn't always equate to value for money. If I give you an example, we have on all PPP transactions a requirement for the private sector to take general change in law risk for 25 years. We're procuring, as a society, the projects. We're the ones that are passing the legislation. But so why would we ask someone to crystal ball gaze and price that at the outset over a 25-year period? It doesn't necessarily equate to value for money. But you're driving a certain mentality towards risk in order to achieve an off-balance sheet. Off-balance sheet might be the right answer for certain transactions, but I think it's about understanding what you're trying to achieve. Out of a pipeline, if you're trying to achieve speed, value for money, infrastructure delivery, then probably from the NAO reports, PFIs take longer to actually sign as a contract. They're complex beasts, and they therefore won't necessarily deliver infrastructure as quickly as other forms of transaction. But equally, you are then bringing it back onto balance sheet, and you're making a choice in terms of what funds to use to build it.
Can I, Deputy Clive, just to come in.
Follow up on one point you were making there about the oversight of contracts, and when risk is supposedly transferred, the public sector doesn't think necessarily it's their job then to look how things are going. Do you accept there's anything really that equates to a self-monitoring or self-managed contract? So I've heard those terms so often around these issues.
I would liken it, and I have likened it on many occasions, to asking society to report themselves to the police at the point that they've driven down the motorway and exceeded the speed limit and get to the other end and pick up the phone. It doesn't work as a behavioural concept.
I'm going to bring the CNAG in because he ultimately is the man who has to audit all the government accounts and just say what the technical position is in terms of on or off balance sheet.
Well, it's obviously changed a lot since the early days of PFI and PPP, where it was easy to suspect that the driving force behind the growth of it so quickly was because it was treated as off balance sheet in the early days. So the clarification that's come through in later years that if it essentially the substance of the transaction is that it's a public asset being used for public purposes and public sectors bearing the risks and rewards of ownership and so on, then it's much clearer now, I think, that they have to be on balance sheet. That's how they're accounted for and audited nowadays. And so actually the decision-making criteria are more now where they need to be, I think, which is what is in the long-term interest of value for money and the service requirement of the particular asset. So I don't think accounting considerations are driving decision-making in the way that they did in the early days of PFI, and I think that's an important step forward.
Thank you very much, CNAG. Sarah and Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Murphy, I'll come to you first. How would you characterise current levels of investor confidence when it comes to UK infrastructure investment?
In terms of UK infrastructure, it's I think there's definitely I think the two common areas. There's a level of frustration insofar as activity levels feel relatively low on that side. It's very hard to get data on this, to be honest. Well, certainly we find it hard to get data on this area explicitly, particularly.
Do you mind me just quickly asking data on
actual
projects,
on actual investment,
activity?
actual new investment being made? Now, I appreciate from a government point of view, there's a heavy focus upon new, what we call sort of greenfield infrastructure. So government wants to see new things being built. The obviously investor market is slightly more ambidextrous in the sense that there's been a lot of activity around investors buying existing assets, whether that be, obviously you've seen that quite heavily around utilities, assets that have already been built or operated being sold. That can create investor opportunities. So the investor world obviously is a little bit wider. So the area I'd focus on, respect for yourselves, would be, I think, new infrastructure investment levels appear to have been very low on that basis.
By historical comparison?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that from an intuitive sense in terms of our own sort of cross-section of transactions. That may feel slightly odd given the environment we're in. I think we feel that we are a little bit at the dip before there should be an immense level of investment that's required, whether that be driven through economic growth or pathway to net zero. So there's a huge amount of investment that will be needed, as I think many of you will know, across the whole sector. So I think investors are probably just concerned around, and I know it's a very trite comment to make, but I think what's often put forward, there is a large amount of capital for relatively little opportunity set. But I think that is going to change quite quickly. So I think it's important to be ahead of that, because the amount of investment over the next 5 to 10 years plus should pick up considerably on the basis of the demands, as I explained earlier. I think in general terms, I totally agree with Bruce that investors have been concerned around long-term political stability insofar as certainly stability around regulation, etc. And that's been a sort of separate topic of huge debates, of course, around the role of the regulator. And, dare I bring this up, but obviously the role of Thames Water in that as well. So issues like that do raise into whole question mark a little bit of a fraying of the confidence around the system. I think that is going through a reset at the moment, but I think investors recognise, again, even in utilities, the huge amount of investment that's needed. Yeah. So it's a little strained in parts, but I think what I find more often than not, in answer to your question, is just a feeling that the activity is not quite what it perhaps should be. I think our sense, though, is for the new government coming in now, it's got a very clear focus in actually delivering the increased investment that's going to be needed.
Thank you. Mr. Dalgleish, have you got anything to add?
Absolutely. I mean, I think confidence levels are high. We're certainly talking to people who have capital to deploy. I think the issue, or the lack of deployment of capital has largely been a product of where to deploy the capital. But I think, the constraining factor, and probably the thing that would worry me more than anything, is our ability to deliver the actual construction as opposed to the money. We've had a construction sector that has obviously had a lack of investment. Even in terms of the expiry challenges we're seeing in terms of infrastructure, sort of post-Grenfell.
Okay, you're talking about sort of skills and labour.
Skills and labour. And, if you look at the private finance deals that have been done recently, often using large multinationals in the UK as opposed to mid-sector construction UK firms. And if you're sitting there trying to look at how do we increase the capacity to deliver infrastructure, probably the constraining factor is resources rather than capital.
Thank you, Chair.
Some of the answer to that skills shortages which you're talking about is that cross-party consensus you were talking about at the beginning. Because if you have a proper pipeline of projects, for example, tunnelling, which is a worldwide asset and skills, the people who own the tunnelling machines know that they've got a pipeline of work for the next 10 years. They're not going to take it off one British project and take it over to Holland or whatever. Is that part of the answer?
Huge. I mean, if almost what you need, is a long, thin pipeline of projects as opposed to a very short, fat pipeline of projects, which probably is counterintuitive politically. If you're trying to achieve something within one administration, but from a sector perspective and retention of skills and labour, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bobby, from the Treasury Select Committee, please.
Thank you, Chair. Continuing on this theme about the infrastructure pipeline and what you kind of need as investors to feel certainty, I suppose, about it. You talked about the cross-party support and also wanting to see sort of sector-by-sector model preferences. Is there anything else more specifically you'll be expecting to see from the government later this summer in order to feel confident in that pipeline?
No, I think a lot of it has been addressed. Insofar as another very hot topic you'd be very aware of course, is a lot of investors have engaged, including myself, in areas such as renewables or other wider sort of construction projects, and we've had an issue around delivery. And it's if you bring it to an area that investors are not the best well versed in, which of course is planning and consenting. Now, obviously, the government has made its steps towards improving the planning process. I think the frustration for many investors has been, I think in general, it just takes too long to deliver anything in the UK in terms of construction. And that has a knock-on impact in terms of the time frames to actually invest in projects. It has a knock-on effect, to Bruce's point, for supply chain, contractors, and therefore indirectly into investors. So I think there's some very big themes that certainly the current government has tried to improve. The importance now is that actually results in the deliverability of that pipeline, because the danger otherwise is what we see is the identification of the right sort of assets, the goals that we're trying to achieve by when, the types of models being used, but the assets themselves not being actually built to that time frame. And that has sadly been a little bit of a UK phenomenon, I'd say.
And just before we go to Bruce Dalgleish, if we can I push you on the sort of sector by sector bit?
Yes.
Would that mean that you would also want to see sectors ruled out just to reduce uncertainty if there isn't any plans for at that time? For instance, there's a new hospitals programme that's ongoing and it's a potential sector you might be interested in, but if it's not mentioned, you might have continued uncertainty.
We would, if I'm being incredibly academic, I think what I'd say is, particularly around this debate about PPP, which for the most part is really central to the discussion of what to do with new social infrastructure. Now, to a degree, this was kind of been the policy of the previous administration, which was to use, as I say, public finance in the main part. In the plan, it will be very clear, and in a sense we have to, my point earlier about reacting to policy, is social infrastructure to say very clearly this is where the policy may allow private finance to be utilised or not. And therefore we can, to be honest, I think from the industry point of view, getting away debating whether it should be used or not would be helpful. So we can get away actually either deliver it or not, right? So then people like me have to go and think my money's not actually to be utilised in the health sector. Then we'll focus on universities, we'll focus on energy. So it gives absolute clarity about where I think we should be a point in time where there's less debate around the model. This is the chance in terms of the plan to then say this is where you should divert your energy.
I think just building on that, I guess the two kind of things just to add, and most of it we've already touched on. One is looking at PPP in the wider sense, in that there are a lot of PPP still happening, that are ultimately government or societal, are taking the risk on them being successful projects. The water industry is obviously doing PPPs, as are universities. So ultimately there is still UK infrastructure happening using PPPs. But in terms of the ask of government, I guess the one that I would add is a sensible procurement strategy. In other words, again, obviously the whole direction of travel is largely devolution in terms of administration and decision making. But if you are only ever going to procure one PPP in your regional area, you're unlikely to have a second chance of doing a better job the next time. And building up a cohort of professional managers who are able to do this time and time again, learn the lessons, move on and refine the process. Because we all make mistakes, that's human nature. And therefore, building that resilience into the system, I would say, is one thing that I would look for from government.
Can I offer one? Sorry.
Of course, yes.
For clarity, I slightly disagree with the point about water sector, because water companies are procuring projects directly, which are based broadly on PPP terms. But the point to bring out is, to be quite honest, PPP has become a little bit pejorative term sense. So that is not formally called, that's actually DPC in a sense, what water companies are doing themselves. But I wanted to raise the point that the use of PPP has become useful but unuseful in the sense that it's being used in a generic sense to be anything where there's a public and private connection versus a very specific model. So when we talk about PPP, we've been thinking about PFI, which in itself hasn't existed for a long time. It's funny how we still use PFI as a terminology, but it's the model where procurement, particularly for social infrastructure, which is tax funded. So universities, again, will be an area, will be debatable as to...
Yeah, not tax funded, but ultimately if they go wrong, they still manifest themselves in a problem probably sitting at government's door or society's door, or water pay, the person who pays the water bill's door, in terms of how that would manifest itself.
Okay, really helpful. I might come back, I've got time on that. Sarah Hall, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question goes to Mr. Murphy first. Hello. What aspects of the infrastructure pipeline do you believe are in most urgent need of attention at the moment?
I think we would look towards is overarching points about delivery. I think a lot of our focus would be on the clear goals that are set out. So a very, very obvious statement would be the mission around Clean Power 2030. If you look at the amount of renewable energy that's needed, the amount of offshore wind that's required, the amount of grid investment that's required, I think as an investor, it's very hard to see how we can get from where we've been with we have been through, even though offshore wind has been a great success at one level, we've had a number of years where there hasn't been a significant amount of investment, and what we're looking at, you'll be aware, is significantly greater than what we've done in the past. So that is an example, and there are others as well, where in order to hit the goals that have been set out, we need to go much faster and with a lot more certainty. And that's the area I think people are looking at to go, how do you go from the goals to actual delivery and start to see that manifest itself in terms of actual activity on the ground.
Yes. And Mr. Dalgleish, what do you think are the constraints that prevent construction and delivery companies from providing quality assets efficiently and timely?
So a successful construction project or a design and construction project has a whole series of things that can affect it. Going from its inception all the way through the planning process, design process. Where we see projects having gone wrong, they're started too early. One of the big benefits of PPP in its broadest sense is that I suppose the restraints to some degree that the funders place upon those models in terms of due diligence and actually making sure it can be delivered. Whereas often with, if I think back to my early days of career with directly procured construction contracts direct by government, often they were started before they should have been started because there was desire to get a shovel in the ground. That was what made the headline. And therefore you ended up changing your mind partway through a design and construction process, and therefore costs went up and delays crept in. And one of the huge benefits that PFI and PPP has brought is that discipline of being able to due diligence a project before it actually moves forward to construction.
Very good. Thank you very much. Michael Payne, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question for both of you, if I may. What your views are on the biggest drivers of cost overruns and poor performance in infrastructure projects?
Gosh, I suspect Bruce will give you a verse of practical experience. I think what we've seen practically, a lot of this comes back to just in hindsight, probably lack of understanding some of the key risks that were facing the particularly around contractors, what they were taking on, and you see that issues have arisen which probably were not necessarily foreseen. Bruce has referred to, lenders do their diligence, and again, it was not necessarily identified. Everything, to my mind, is a little bit idiosyncratic insofar as the specifics. But I think in general, the issue is probably just a overestimation in terms of a sense of how straightforward the project was to deliver, and probably an incentive to actually just to Bruce's point, drive quicker than perhaps the project was ready. And the track record will be mixed on that front. I think there are a lot of complex projects that have been delivered to time and budget. Equally, you can see a lot of clear negatives. But Bruce may have some more. He deals with a lot more practical examples of this, I guess.
I think if you look back at the history of PPP and probably compare it to publicly procured infrastructure, I don't have the statistics, but I'm pretty certain probably PPPs would come out very strongly in terms of delivery of the construction phase within time and to budget. By comparison, equally there are a whole bunch of risks, particularly if we are going to see an increase in infrastructure spend and what we're trying to do, that we need to be aware of, and this comes almost back to procurement. How many projects do you want sitting with one contractor if they're of national significance? Where is that oversight coming from in terms of managing a portfolio to make sure that we're actually placing work? And we've obviously all seen Carillion, the collapse of Carillion a few years ago, which created issues. Carillion weren't the first, they won't be the last, I'm sure. And looking at that from a macro level is important to make sure that we're actually managing the procurement pipeline, but also managing that sector in a way that ends up delivering what we need it to.
Right. Just thinking about one or two specific examples, because Bruce mentions. I look at it from our perspective, particularly as a debt investor. If I think about practically, the two areas you get most worried about in evidence where there's been a delay is contractor effectively insolvency. So the Carillion issues created. There have been, unfortunately, others, in many cases, subcontractor insolvencies. So they're the risk issues that really affect you on that side. I think generally a contractor who can manage a project that's slightly running over time is more manageable and certainly causes relatively less stress. The other area it's important to stress, because we're thinking there of relatively straightforward civil engineering projects, but technology projects. So if you look in areas like energy from waste, biomass, etc., there's a lot of examples there where it's the technology risk that was the evidence around why the project was late. So cautious investigation towards projects where there's new technology risk would be important.
Just one further question, if I may, Chair, to Mr Dalgleish, but Mr Murphy may wish to come in as well. What do you think needs to change to improve the preparedness of public bodies for contract expiry?
So part of that is education and guidance, and I think there's a huge amount of work being done. I think the bit that we probably haven't really tackled as yet, we did the first education expiry, we've done the first health handback, is the level of resource that takes. And for one individual authority, coming back to that kind of portfolio approach, it's really difficult if you've got one PFI or one PPP coming through the expiry process. If we can look at a different way of working whereby groups of individuals are moving from one project to another project to another project, even within a region, and learning from those experiences, we will get better, both as an industry but also as a public sector.
I think we'd agree that I think the steps been made to date to manage this centrally has been welcome. So I think the role of what is now NISTA in previously in IPA in providing more standardised guidance is welcome, because obviously a rather relatively unique feature globally of UK PPP PFI is the widespread nature of the counterparties in terms of local authorities, trust, etc. So for that reason, centralisation is very important, particularly for what again is very idiosyncratic risks about an individual project and its expiry, but being able to have the right framework is welcome.
Thank you, Chair.
I've got one or two questions. Coming back to what you were just saying, Bruce, in terms of encouraging people to actually bid for these contracts, which costs a lot of money and they were often very slow and very long to negotiate. One of our witnesses, Fintex UK, has a few suggestions, and I would be interested to get both of your reaction to these suggestions. And very quickly, they are: mandate digitalised contract repositories, standardised contract metadata, leverage AI-powered analytics for live contract, embed structured collaboration and agile variation processes, and build capability access in the public sector. Now, there's a lot in that, I accept, but do you want to just comment on any or all of that?
I think all are valid. I'm not entirely sure where variations come into that. I think variations are probably a topic in their own right in terms of PPP contracts. When you change your mind, cost escalation happens. I think coming back to something Darryl said earlier, it's about having clarity on the model, is a huge aspect to this, because you don't want to be playing with risk profiles and changes to the structure within a live bidding environment. You need the rules of the game set out. I think the one thing that I would say about PPP projects is it drives, in some ways, an anti-competitive nature in terms of the bidding, because you are asking people to form consortia. So rather than having a competitive dialogue or competitive tendering process for the design and construction process itself, you're asking people to wrap into a consortia funding, equity, long-term operation and design and construction, which means that you often or could end up with a position where a consortia is winning. They might not be the best design and construction solution, but on a net present value basis, it works out as great value for money compared to another. Whereas actually, if you disaggregated those and tendered the constituent elements and then brought together a consortia partway through the process, you potentially could get a better outcome.
So, Darryl, and Bruce, do come in on this question. You talked about Tideway Tunnel, which was a different model, really. It was a regulated asset-based model, not a PFI model, and it was extremely successful, not least of which because it was struck at very low interest rates. But one of the features about that model was the government provided guarantees about some of the unknowns in it, notably if the special purpose vehicle was to be suspended for a period of time. So what role do you think in making these simpler and in making them more easy to understand by both sides government guarantees play?
I think they're very effective where targeted at very particular points. So we're a large debt investor in Thames Tideway Tunnel, and you're absolutely right, the government support package was intrinsically important. It covers, you may be aware, a number of things. The thing that it really covers that investors are most worried about is it's in sort of engineering terms the tail risk, i.e. the catastrophic tunnel collapse risk that we're faced, particularly given something that may have been uninsurable in a sense. So the idea of, and actually what happens if you can't even put that cost on, back to the point about the consumer, so therefore who's going to have to pick that up? So I think in that instance, the technical risk was very pragmatic to look at the technical risks involved. There are other risks which are covered, which in hindsight are perhaps more debatable whether it was needed or not. There was concern on state of the financial markets, etc. As it happened, that wasn't necessarily needed. It's a very live topic, I'm aware, given the potential future use of similar models in the water industry around should there be reservoirs exactly. So I was consulted on one last week. I said openly, I am not necessarily, I don't think we should be we need to progress from the old thinking, which is, well, we had it on this project, so we want it on the reservoir. The risk around a reservoir could well be very different to building a tunnel under the Thames. So from that basis, do you need to have that cover? But the use of a guarantee in general, that to really focus on specific risks, is very effective.
And is it even more important where there are projects where there are simply unknowns that nobody knows? For example, building a nuclear power station, there are risks there that no private financier or constructor could possibly know, and therefore you need a sovereign guarantee.
I think so we'll use examples there. We're saying it's always the unknown unknowns, of course, that get you. The problem it comes back to is that value for money consideration is, are you paying for, if by basically passing that risk indirectly or directly, are you paying for that, as opposed to, is it better value to take that risk off the equation to get a better price, as it were? So it's a very extreme version of a more general value for money consideration, which to some degree I think I'm referring back to the comment on balance sheet. We were led too much, I think openly we were led too much by balance sheet considerations rather than value for money from a risk point of view. If you actually took off, which I'm not sure is it more a matter of government policy, if you took balance sheets off the table, you can then come to a better balance of what risk allocation is appropriate and therefore what best value for money do you achieve.
So one final question, we're running out of time. And it's this. I don't know whether you're aware of the Stockton schools issue, either of you, but the basic issue appears there to be that the local authorities run out of money and can't afford to pay the PFI annualised payments. And I'm wondering what a knock-on effect that would have on you as financiers if the government, as they seem to wish, to transfer more of these big funding issues to the new mayors that are going to be created by these strategic authorities. If there was a risk of non-payment, non-annualised payment, should there in fact be a guarantee that if you have a big contract like that, the government would step in if the local authority couldn't afford to pay?
I think the issue you're talking here about affecting more broadly local authority or similar credit risk, we take we do a lot of work on, because there's a lot of indirect or direct risk that one can take through that point. It is fair to say the point being is really consideration. It's the same generic answer around: are you at risk of paying more for that service in terms of or cost of finance relative to the ability by putting a backstop in? And it'd be fair to say a lot of investors are forced to take a view, even though it's not written clearly from a point of view of that risk transfer, of the suggestion that the guarantee is implicit insofar as the belief of, do you believe that government would step away from a local authority? So I think there's an interesting balance there around, do you get a better value for money solution by making it overt rather than forcing people to take an implicit view?
When foundation trusts were first set up, the funding market required a deed of safeguard, in terms of insolvency of foundation trusts. It's no different to that. The question, I suppose, is, having paid for a certain risk profile in terms of borrowing, do you now give a guarantee part way through, and would you expect a betterment of terms as a result? And probably not. But again, it's all about value for money. Rather than sitting there and saying, this should be a risk profile that applies to every type of transaction, it's trying to say, where is the risk best managed? And if we're taking something like credit risk or insolvency risk, is that best ultimately kept with government in order to provide better value for money for individual transactions?
Well, I can't thank you enough. You're both very busy and experienced people. You've given us a wealth of your knowledge this afternoon, and it's set us up very well for our public hearing with officials. So thank you both very, very much indeed for coming this afternoon.
Thank you.
Order. We'll now take the clock stands at 16:19. Call it 16:20. Shall we resume with our public witnesses sharply at 16:25, please? And today, order. Welcome back to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 12th of May 2025. We now moved into our main session. We've just heard from an excellent panel of witnesses on the costs and benefits of private finance for infrastructure investment, which the government sees as central to growing the economy. In the autumn budget last year, the Chancellor announced that the government would increase public sector net investment, PSNI, to 2.6% of GDP during the current Parliament, with over £100 billion of additional capital invested over the next 5 years. The government has also made a number of changes to the framework for infrastructure investment and took the decision to combine the National Infrastructure Commission and the Infrastructure Project Authority to create the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority, or NISTA, who we will be hearing from today. In the light of these major changes, this afternoon we will be exploring the suitability of private finance for infrastructure investment and questioning government officials on how they plan to create the right conditions to support investor and public confidence in the use of this financing model for infrastructure. So we're very pleased this afternoon to have with us one of our regular attenders, the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, James Bowler. Very welcome, warm welcome, James.
Thank you.
Conrad Smewing, who is also a regular attender at this committee, who is, of course, DG for Public Spending at the Treasury and joined the Treasury in 2003 and has held a number of roles there, including Director of Spending. Welcome, Conrad. David Lunn, Interim Commercial Finance Director. David joined HMT in 2009 and led the establishment of the UK Infrastructure Bank in 2021, both as a board member and as the bank's first Chief Operating Officer. So, welcome, David. I believe this is your first time attending the committee?
Second time.
Second time. Okay. I was going to give you a special first-time welcome, but anyway, welcome back. Jean-Christophe Gray, Interim Chief Executive, took on the role of Interim Chief Executive for NISTA in April 25, and prior to this you were a member of the Strategic Defence Review Expert Team. Is that right, Jean-Christophe?
Yes.
Great. And finally, by no means least, Matthew Vickerstaff, Deputy Chief Executive of NISTA and Head of Government's Project Finance Profession. And also a particularly warm welcome to Bobby Dean, who is a member of the Treasury Select Committee. You're very welcome too, Bobby. So I think I will make a start. And to James Bowler, how do you plan to use the lessons learned from past projects to improve the implementation and management of privately financed projects?
That's a very big question. Thanks for having us.
I thought we'd give you an easy opening.
Yeah. Well, it all started when I was young. No. Look, the NAO's report is an excellent report. It builds on 140 individual reports, I think, and has 12 recommendations in it to do just as you say, Chair, to improve how we go about using private finance for infrastructure in the future. There has 12 recommendations in it, and we're happy with all 12. I would say that the key lessons learnt, you could pick many. I would look to 4 that we need to improve. Set the right conditions for success, number 1. We can talk further about that, which is about certainty and for investors. Appropriate risk allocation between public and private sectors. And we've learnt a lot, particularly from many of the examples in that. I'd say that's number 2. End-to-end contract management and delivery of projects right through to their expiry and potential handing over of assets. I'd say that's number 3. And dealing with the risk of failure. For example, the likes of the reports and realities of the Carillion experience. I'd say that's number 4. There's many more you could point to, but those are the sort of buckets I would choose. And I would say in conclusion, there's no one-size-fits-all to the financing model, but that the rich lessons that we have learnt that are included there and I've just summarised, I think we're well on our way to ensuring we're in a better position to do exactly as you said, to increase PSNI and private finance into public sector infrastructure delivery.
It's a very concise reply to my question. Whilst I'm just sort of addressing you directly, I don't know whether you were present at the previous session, but we had a discussion about whether these PPPs should be on or off balance sheet. Mm-hmm. What is your view as Permanent Secretary of the Treasury on that matter?
Well, it depends what they do. So classification is not an end or an aim. The aim is the outcome of what you're trying to achieve, and the aim is value for money. So the Green Book that you all know very well and we follow concisely, and obviously write ourselves, is very clear that classification is not an end of a project mean. So the answer, and I'll give you an example, is that is that you really want the correct structure for any particular project to be delivered well, and that can be on or off balance sheet. The most prescient example at the moment, a very large example, is we're going through, as you know, Sizewell C expansion. That's likely to be on balance sheet, but we still think the regulated asset model that we're pursuing there is the right one to pursue, and we still involve quite a large amount of private finance in that as we're crowding in, and we're hoping that we're planning on that to deliver the project to time and to budget.
Well, thank you very much, that's given us a lot of opening, and I'm sure we'll examine a lot of those aspects. So to move that on, we're coming to Sarah Hall, please.
Thank you, Chair. And my questions are going to be directed to Mr. Gray. Hello.
Hi there.
Hi. Investors, I know in the short, investors have previously highlighted the fact that the pipeline, the infrastructure pipeline, has been too short term. That decision making has made it difficult for investors to make those longer term decisions, that it's lacked consistency, that it's caused issues with future planning, and that it's not a viable way to plan for investments. So what are you doing to create a pipeline for investors that actually supports that long term decision making?
Sure, and I think it may have been something that one of the previous expert witnesses picked up on in the session just now. I pick up a couple of things. Firstly, it's very important that it's done in the context of a 10-year infrastructure strategy, and David at some point may wish to talk a little bit about that, which sets out over a long term and with a commitment to publish such a strategy regularly, sets a long-term trajectory. On the pipeline itself, as you say, previously, we've had a more construction industry-focused pipeline, and it hasn't always been done annually, for example. And what we are trying, building on some of the lessons that are in the report, is to develop that into an investor-focused pipeline, because this is all about trying to crowd in investment. So a couple of things that I think are salient to that. First, and the first of these pipelines will accompany the 10-year strategy this summer. First is it will be a commitment to update that and republish that pipeline on a very regular basis. I think my expectation would be around every 6 months. The second is to go from a construction pipeline which has tended to give information, yes, around cost and schedule, but one towards that gives greater granularity to investors around the types of financing models that various projects are willing to entertain. Now, I think it is fair to say that it will take a little time following the publication of the infrastructure strategy and the first pipeline to continue to develop that as departments, once they have their settlements, can work through the types of financing models and procurement models they may wish. But to slightly borrow the phrase, I think we very much hear the point from earlier, which is that a longer, thinner pipeline is better than a shorter one.
One of the issues that was raised before was the pipeline as it was before. There were obviously gaps between those 2019, 2020, 2022, which then caused issues in terms of even being able to analyse the data that was, because it was so inconsistent. So, it's a good thing to have that long-term strategy, but ensuring that it actually is refreshed and reviewed and analysed at a regular basis is really important for that consistency and that confidence, I guess, for the investors.
Yeah, and it's something that you're absolutely right. It's something that has been heard loud. I think that Treasury ministers, officials, have heard loud and clear through the British Infrastructure Task Force as well. That the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary have had and have been giving insights from the investor base. As you say, a regular publication every 6 months is really important. I think there are some other things you'll want to accompany it with, and maybe this is an opportunity to describe NISTA a little bit, which is, of course, yes, NISTA has an important responsibility for the pipeline, but some of the things around that, in particular, sources of financing, for example, how you might interact with the National Wealth Fund, how we can help investors better understand the geographical allocation of some projects NISTA is going to develop, or is in the process, is currently developing in partnership with MHCLG, an enhanced sort of spatial analysis capability that will try and describe more comprehensively the full range of infrastructure and the interaction between those in each area. I think those will all be important elements, and I'm sure we'll get quite a lot of feedback, to put it directly, from investors on the first pipeline, which we'll want to learn from.
Okay, thank you for that. And final question from me, how will you prioritise projects within the infrastructure pipeline to ensure that resources are focused on those critical investments?
Well, in a sense, I think that will flow from the prioritisation that is in the 10-year infrastructure strategy, and that first and foremost, from a policy perspective, are the ones that the government believes are best aligned to the important productivity and growth enhancing objectives that it has. Second, perhaps I should have said this in my previous answer, both the strategy and NISTA, in a way that wasn't the case with the National Infrastructure Commission, for example, is looking across economic and social infrastructure. The NIC, as was very much focused on economic, so we'll want to go across the full range of that. The flip side is you also don't want to go, you want to be careful about not getting ahead of yourself. I think it will be very important that projects that are on the pipeline are accompanied with an appropriate level of detail, in particular around financing models that investors can take. And there'll be a role for NISTA and the Centre of Government to challenge contracting authorities to say, have you got the appropriate level of details required?
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Jean-Christophe, is there a danger, I mean, bearing in mind what the previous witnesses said, that the more you do a similar type of project, the better you become at it, of actually going for the easy ones, and then the more difficult ones, the sort of nuclear power stations, the Sizewell Bs, the CCUSs of this world, get left behind because they're so difficult. The easy ones would get built first.
Well, look, it'll be important to guard against a range of risk. I guess the factors, as James was saying, I mean, we are progressing with Sizewell, we are progressing with CCUS. I'll pick at the risk of picking another tricky area, I'll say the government is really ambitious in the area of small modular reactors, for example, which is a new type of technology. So, look, I think I've certainly got the message as the interim CEO about the importance of really unlocking the big projects that will make the biggest impact on growth. But I'm sure we'll need to guard against a range of things.
Thank you very much. Sarah Green, please.
Thank you, Chair. Sticking with the
sorry,
pipeline.
sorry, Sarah, just a second. James, did you want to come in?
So it's just to help.
Sorry, Sarah.
Just to help widen the thing. I mean, I guess it comes down to this one-size-fits-all point, and some of those projects you will want to take a particular structure to, and some of the other projects you might use similar things again and again. But on the very large projects, some of the structures are unique, and you want to take your own way of doing them. So I was sort of saying I think that's why you don't do one size fits all. Otherwise, you end up doing the easier things.
Sorry, Sarah.
No, thank you, Chair. Sticking with the pipeline, if I may address my question to Mr. Vickerstaff. What risks or challenges do you see to successfully building a credible pipeline?
I think the real challenge with the pipeline is developing those investable models. We have a number, so we have the regulated asset-based model, we have contracts for difference. We take carbon capture, utilisation and storage, we now have dispatchable power agreements, we have types of CFDs, contracts for difference, which work with emitters. So we are evolving those. But the real challenge is not so much working up the finance, it's actually working up the funding models. So it's developing an investable set of projects which will attract not just domestic capital but international capital as well. Because if you do that, you'll drive down the price and get a better outturn in terms of overall projects.
Thank you. And if I could address you, James, if
Yeah,
I may.
certainly.
How will you ensure that your approach provides potential investors in UK infrastructure with the information they need?
Well, through this 10-year strategy that we're going to publish and through this pipeline, through a renewed and expanded Office for Investment that will be actively out there selling the opportunities for investment in the UK, and are taken all in all after a period of quite some volatility, global crises, etc. You're looking for a period of clarity, stability, long-termism. I'd add we've got a set of fiscal rules which no longer incentivise moving money from capital to resource spending, and that has led to a disruption in the funding available for capital projects, and has been accused of bringing short-termism into things. So the spending review intends to set out 5-year capital budgets. So all of those things point to a much more long-term approach to that, and we're very clear that investors want clarity, stability and transparency.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's very hot in here. Jean-Christophe is very wisely taking his jacket off. Everybody else is welcome to follow his example if they wish.
Should I have asked for permission? Should I have asked for permission?
No, you're the trendsetter.
Oh, right. That's the first time that's ever been said.
Bobby.
Thank you.
Bobby Dean.
I'd like to move on to skills, and maybe I'll start with you, Conrad, if I can. So obviously a sort of a long-running criticism that the public sector just simply doesn't have the skills to manage large infrastructure projects like this, particularly when it involves private finance. And I've got a report here from 2017 where kind of civil service recognises this capability gap and says it's going to work on it. So could you bring us up to date on what the Treasury's been doing to address that sort of skill shortage and what the plans are for the future to gear up for more infrastructure investment?
Well, I might start, but I think actually Matthew and NISTA might want to say a bit more, because the primary thing that we have done is pull together first in the IPA and then moving into NISTA a sort of central capability of people who can help in both the sort of structuring of these sorts of contracts and deals, and in there and support authorities in the management of those deals as things go on. Obviously, in individual departments which do a lot of this kind of stuff. So, for example, in Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, which does a lot of contracts for difference and RAB models, which Matthew was talking about, they also have their own expertise. But I don't know, Matthew, would want to add a bit more on that.
Yes, I think that in the previous session, that this was a question as well that you focused on, and I think it was Darryl and Bruce flagged the fact that we are dealing with local authorities, NHS trusts, and other contracting authorities who don't necessarily have the right expertise, skills, capability. We have got a number of programs that we're running. So training, that is something we've been very successful with in terms of online and actually in-person training. You really need to train contract managers within the public sector. We have guidance and toolkits that we're providing. We've just actually published the Asset Condition Playbook, how you go about taking a survey of the built environment, whether it be a hospital, school, police station, court, etc. Really practical steps to help contract managers manage their underlying contract. I think probably the most influential on a hands-on basis is that we have developed an associate pool of 60 people who are experts, ex-accountants, bankers, lawyers, facilities management contractors, surveyors and also technical experts who actually provide an advice and support to local authorities, NHS, trusts, etc. Good news is as well, it's cheaper than hiring expensive consultants, and it is also a way of giving on-the-shoulder advice to actually get contract managers through understanding how to manage their contracts. I think James wants to...
Yes, James.
That's a really good example. I mean, I just wanted to sort of take a step back and say, compared to where we were, certainly at the outset of private finance initiatives, and even by the 2017 report, I think that the government has really recognised the need for professional skilling. So we've got, and let me talk to 3 points. One, we've got NISTA, and that brings together obviously the strategy of the NIC, but also the delivery of the former IPA, and in particular it brings in a lot of focus on contract management. I'm sure you'll have quite a few questions on that really wasn't there as much as it should have been from the outset. So that's sort of point one. The other thing to say is we now have these public financial institutions, most obviously the National Wealth Fund, where we are going to say they only do the big financial transactions projects, and that's because they have the skills to do them properly. So you'll know we've expanded the National Wealth Fund, for example, and the British Business Bank, and they will undersee those things. And then we have UK government investment, UKGI, which had some forerunners, but is now an expert government shareholder. So I'd point to sort of at the centre being in a lot stronger position to have the professional skills to do that. It still requires the role that Matthew has set out to make sure that we reach all the different elements of the public sector that might be contracting. But of course, in 2018 we finished the PFI projects as we had them before, so that's very much now an advisory role on contract management.
If I may, I was just going to finish. Every project now, 7 years out from expiry, 5 years out and 3 years, we undertake an expiry health check. So we sit down with the often chief executive or finance director, section 151 officer of the local authority and the contract manager to go through how well prepared they are for expiry. And that's basically identifying ways that we can support them with tools, with advice and support, or just getting their governance structure right so that they really own that expiry process. We've now done just around 250 of those, and that's added into our next phase, where we're collecting a lot more data about asset condition and also expiry processes so that we can go back to all local authorities. You'll have seen in our data collection, we are monitoring all expiries, and there's a bow wave coming in 2030, another 2 bow waves in 2036-37. There's still 135 billion of payments to be made under those contracts. Got to ensure that we get value for money for them.
If I may, Chair, just a quick follow-up. Of course. So it sounds like you've tried to reduce your reliance on external consultants and almost build your own sort of consultant team that's able to provide that advice to both departments, but also other contract managers like local authorities. Is that accurate?
As an element of what we would really like to do is keep the lawyers out of it, because there are too many disputes and too many costly processes involving very expensive lawyers. So we can head things off at the pass, just like good project management, front load it, stop disputes happening, then we can keep the really expensive part of professional services out of PFI.
Yes, and so I guess that's a kind of rejection of the argument that there's something unique about the public sector that means they can't have these sorts of skills on board, whether it to be with culture or pay, for example. But is the risk to that the pipeline? We spoke about pipeline earlier as well, but if we don't have the pipeline, the ability of us to retain such talent is going to be much more difficult. Is not having a sufficient pipeline of projects a key risk to the retention of a team like that you're building?
I think there is no doubt that both the private sector and public sector, if you have that kind of stop-start dynamic in terms of there's workload, there's not workload, then the talent will fly. And there is talent flight. somewhat ironic, there's almost a renaissance in PFI because people can see the next 15 years, the final contract is actually 2048. There's a huge amount of work to be done. There's a huge amount of money to be spent and projects to be undertaken. So it's kind of odd. There's almost a renaissance attracting talent back into the sector. And that will help new projects and the new initiatives under the pipeline.
Can I just follow that question up? With this 3 and 5 year MOT that NISTA is going to give all of these PFI holders, 600 of them.
Is giving.
Is doing, yes. No, I'm delighted to hear that. There's going to be 600 of them over the next decade. Do you do more than that? So if I'm a local authority with one of these big projects for a big school or something, but I don't have the estates management team to be able to conduct the negotiations that you talk about, will you then step in and help that local authority?
The other pillar, the advice and support, using our associate pool, but also working with technical consultants as well, we do provide that on-the-shoulder help, advice and support.
Thank you very much.
There's certainly examples of NISTA intervening with the relevant department, DFE, to, if you like, reset and reconsider some contracts as they reach expiry.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Clive Betts.
So how is a decision made about what's the best way to fund and organise a major project? Is it down to cost or is it down to value for money, or the two?
It's down to value for money, and it's set out in the Green Book. It isn't the case that there is it should be privately financed. It isn't the case it should be publicly financed. It isn't the case that there's one particular part of private finance over the other. So you need to test each of those as you go through, thinking about just that question. And the overall driver is, how do you achieve the outcomes you're trying to deliver, and how do you do so with the best value for money? And there's Conrad could take you in detail through how you go through it, and obviously with these huge.
Give us more information then, Conrad.
Yeah, sure.
And how do you decide which method of private finance would be most appropriate?
Yeah, so, fundamentally, you're, as James is saying, you're weighing benefits and costs. So on the benefits side first, what are the benefits of involving private finance in any of these projects in some way? It's fundamentally that they have much sharper incentives for risk management, and they have, therefore, the kind of incentive to access, both to sort of do a lot more front-end due diligence on the projects, and they have access to tend to be access to sort of more skilled and experienced people for delivery of these projects. If you're thinking if you're building power stations, the best people in the world for building power stations tend to be in the private sector rather than the public sector. And so that sharper set of incentives for delivery can lead to better performance and outcomes. So that's kind of fundamentally on the benefit side. On the cost side, you're looking at a couple of things. Firstly, the extra cost of the private finance. The NAO did some really good work in the report to have a look at, on average, what those extra costs would be. And I think they showed that for the debt portion of private finance, you're looking at kind of 1 to 2 percentage points above the gilt rate of finance cost. I think you'll be careful in interpreting that, because that is a sort of pricing of risk by the private sector. That risk doesn't go away if you use public finance. So when we're making these kind of calculations in the Green Book of whether to go for public or private finance, you've got to take account of the risk that the public sector is retaining if you're going for public sector finance, and do that kind of risk adjustment. So the Green Book does that. So you're weighing up a public sector comparator, publicly financed, cheaper finance from gilts, but all the risk in the public sector, versus different options for involving the private sector and different risks to transfer to the private sector. And so this is a sort of long, complicated answer, because it's different for every project, and you've got to do quite a lot of careful options appraisal to see whether it is worth it in these circumstances to transfer that set of risks.
Right, a layperson looking at this, it seems very strange that when you're doing the assessments about where value for money lies, which cost obviously is a key part of that, you don't take account of the cost of borrowing, the different costs of borrowing that obviously more expensive if the private sector is doing it rather than the public sector. I know you just mentioned risk, but in the end, it isn't just risk, is it, that the private sector is pricing for? It's profit as well. You're not taking that into account.
Well, so what you're comparing is the expected cost to the public sector under the privately financed version, which will include all of the costs of the finance, whether you want to refer to it as sort of profit or reward for taking risk or whatever. Like you're comparing that stream of payments to your assessment of what the cost would be in the public sector. So you absolutely would take into account the extra cost of the private finance.
Well, the NAO report says that isn't done, but it is done in other countries.
So the NAO report says that the Green Book doesn't do a direct comparison to the gilt rate. What the Green Book uses is the social time preference rate. So in some other countries, I think what the NAO are pointing to is that they redo the calculation as gilts go up and down the whole time. We have a more basic, a sort of more straightforward approach of just using the same discount rate in the Green Book all the time. But what the NAO, we can ask Simon, like they're not saying that we're ignoring the extra cost of private finance when we're doing the calculation.
That's not what it was implied in the NAO report. Anyway.
So, I mean, it is the case that we take into account the extra cost of private finance.
So we're talking paragraph 324, and we've got lots of previous reports where we've talked about the Green Book and the use of social time preference rate as a discount rate versus the government gilt rate. And government gilts are kind of implicit in the social time preference rate, but it's not a direct comparison, unlike other countries where they explicitly take into account the cost of government borrowing.
Yeah, so it's about the risk-free rate rather than the cost of private finance. It's the point that the NAO are making.
But and it's worth saying, fundamentally, you can do this in the public sector. There's lots of reasons why you would do things in the public sector. There's lots of things that the private sector won't be very good at, like national security or big uncertainty. And secondly, that's why you have a public sector comparator you compare it against. So ultimately, taking in the technical point about the costs of finance, you'd need to be convinced that by bringing in the private sector, they are managing a risk better than you could do it in the public sector, and therefore bringing the overall either the cost down or the benefits up of that, and you'd want to prove that to yourself.
Right. So it's transfer of risk vis-a-vis the higher cost of borrowing. They're the two key issues you're looking at.
That's basically it. I mean, there are other things that need to be taken into account as well, which are harder to take into account in that kind of comparison. So one of them is the flexibility or not that you might require from a contract in future. So if the asset that you're procuring is one where the public service that is using the asset frequently gets reconfigured or needs changes, then the inflexibility of a very long-term private contract can mean that that's less worthwhile. But if you've got something relatively clear, like you need kind of renewable power stations, you're trying to take power from them, that works much better.
Yeah. It's the cost of changing the contracts midstream
exactly.
Really hits the public sector, isn't it?
That's been one of the big lessons.
That's exactly
you
right.
Want stability. What private finance works best with stability.
Yeah. The longer the contract, presumably, the more that comes into play.
It depends what you're delivering. If you're delivering a road, it's pretty timeless to a certain extent. But if you're delivering something where it can change to political decisions or there's a lot of flexibility, and it's difficult to write a contract that can, for both sides, do that. And with more flexibility, people are probably going to ask for more risk cover.
But it also comes back to that question of like which risks you want to transfer to the private sector and which ones you want to retain for your for the public sector. You only want to transfer the risks where they're in a better position to manage them. So like construction risk being the absolute classic example of that. So if you look at the design of like a contract for difference or one of the regulated asset-based models that you're looking at for Sizewell, that is transferring construction risk or some elements of construction risk to the private sector, so they've got a better incentive there, but it's not transferring some long-term price risks, which is difficult for them to take.
Another example, just genuinely trying to be helpful, the recent delivery of the Thames Tideway tunnel.
Good example.
The government took on some of the extreme risks, which might meant that project would otherwise not have gone ahead in the private sector, or would have gone ahead at a level of cost that would have ended up putting a large cost on bill payers or whatever, and by taking over some of the more extreme risks, the project was able to go ahead, whereas otherwise potentially wouldn't have.
No risk transfer, then should be funded privately, should it?
Certainly, you need. I mean, the whole purpose of this is to transfer those risks properly, have them manage them, have the incentives to manage them. So if there's no risk transfer, then it wouldn't be worth doing. I think it's worth, just to expand a little bit on what James was saying there about the Thames Tideway tunnel, there are kind of like ranges of risk where within that range it's reasonable for the private sector can manage that at a reasonable cost. You can get into extreme levels of risk which they would have to charge a very large amount for in order to take, and they're not actually well placed to manage. You can design structures which keep those risks in the public sector, and that's how Thames Tideway was designed.
So looking at the returns that the private sector should be getting for these projects, should it be directly related to the risks that they are having to take on board?
It should be, and it should be, the returns that they get should be determined in a competitive market, so they're bidding against each other, given the risk in their assessment of the risk in the contract, the difficulty of delivering it. They're incentivised to give the best price for both finance and the contract to deliver it. Yeah.
Just thinking, the examples you're using, but back to what happened under PFI. I'll do an example that I've used in other contexts. If a school's being funded under PFI, what is the risk? I mean, the school's there. The authority is going to give the money for certain elements, or the government is. It's a guarantee, basically, to have money for that project. The only change might be that the number of children falls, and you don't need as many services, but you carry on getting paid for them. That's happened in a number of schools. I understand that. Isn't there a difference there with building a leisure centre, where you've got to attract the customers through the door, so you're not guaranteed? Should really we build schools through PFR?
Well, I mean, it's probably worth saying that PFI went on a very long journey, a journey that there are no new PFI things as originally done from 2018. I think to start with, there were excessive returns in some areas and so-called value leakage. Which colleagues can define better than me. But that it started in I guess 1992. It went through a number of guises to try and address that, and in particular, the so-called PF2 was much developed on that. I mean, Matthew, do you want to come in on how you do a schools project to avoid to transfer risk appropriately?
Well, maybe I can challenge just what we're seeing on school projects. Leaking roofs is a consistent, constant drumbeat. Fire door stopping acoustics, lighting levels, the ability of classrooms to be operable in a new environment, whiteboard environment, if they've been delivered historically. Problems around, funnily enough, leisure centres or sports facilities, contamination of land that old schools were built on, or if you are doing refurbishments of very old buildings, latent defects creating real problems. As you perhaps know as well, construction, wall ties being a problem. Edinburgh schools have that problem. Lancashire has got an issue. Those are risks that need to be managed. One could say, are they being properly managed by the private sector? But they are still risks which need to be managed and controlled. So it's not always as simple to say these buildings look after themselves, because in reality they don't. If we then look at...
Oh, sorry, have any of those problems occurred with PFI?
Yes. Yes. No, absolutely. No, we are trying... That's my point.
His point is that they're going to happen regardless of the...
Leaking roofs, the dash to get the roof ready for September, I cannot tell you how many PFI schools have got that problem, and we need to get the private sector to fix it. Acoustics, LED replacement of light bulbs. So some students are there wearing sunglasses in classrooms because it's not been properly done. That's where we've got private sector managing that. Absolutely. Some facilities are really good quality and are being managed really well. So it's not one size fits all, I would suggest.
Well, we're almost making the point that perhaps we shouldn't have gone down that route because it's not actually working. But anyway, I think Jean-Christophe wanted to come in. And
I think we are making sure that the private sector are fixing that, and they are showing signs and wanting to do exactly that.
Jean-Christophe.
Actually, I was about to say, I think Mr. Ryan was trying to...
Yes, he is. He is.
Sorry, this was just very briefly, Mr. Vickerstaff, following on from the point that Clive Betts just made, is that there are schools in Lancashire, as you say, with this wall plug problem, problems with roofs, problems with lighting, acoustics, stairs, all sorts of issues. They blame their PFI for these problems. They don't blame the building they had before. So I kind of accept your point, but I think the point from a lot of these schools and hospitals, actually, certainly from my neck of the woods, is that these problems arose through their PFI, and now because of the PFI and the sort of, it's not quite litigious, but the sort of onerous nature of dealing with the contractor, they now don't get solved in the fashion that they used to. There are some serious problems with this, and I think I think you're making the point for Clive Betts, if I'm honest.
In terms of of lessons learned, the construction, so making sure that construction is monitored by a clerk of works and independently certified would be a really important factor moving forward, because construction defects have been a problem because the construction contracts, whether it be in public sector or private sector, have not been well monitored and controlled.
Yeah, but I was making the point, I think, that why go to PFI or privately financed initiatives if they're more expensive in terms of borrowing the money, raising the money? So what benefits do you get? Well, you transfer the risk, but the risk here is a risk that's been created by the contractor themselves by building shoddy buildings.
Well, yeah, I would say that compared with 25 years ago, the asset management, the building information systems and computer-aided facilities management has vastly improved. So we're dealing with a generation of contracts which would be certainly improved, whether it be public sector or private sector.
Well, exactly.
I'm ambivalent, in terms of, but what we need to make sure is that we learn from the mistakes and definitely get them to fix the problems that we're experiencing in some situations.
I'll just come on to Jean-Christophe then. I assume this is helping local authorities now at the very beginning, if they are involved in these contracts, or a hospital trust, whoever, to have that expertise. To assess the risk and make sure they're properly taken account of right at the beginning.
The Chief Secretary of the Treasury has said that one of the things that NISTA will be responsible for is a new approach to approvals of projects right at the outset.
Okay.
One more follow-up, if that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Conrad, so you said earlier on about the Green Book having to take account of some assumed risks to the public sector as well. I guess might not necessarily be explicitly part of the contract with the firm. So I guess this is potentially firm failures, or if there was to be some, rat discovered in a roof or something where the public sector would be kind of expected to come in. where you're making those assumptions, does it not make more sense to have those upfront in the contract negotiations? Would that not drive down the cost to the taxpayer?
So, it's actually what the Green Book methodology is trying to do is precisely to make a sort of fair comparison between a contract in which you've transferred a bunch of risks to the private sector, and in theory, at least, according to the contract, like they're responsible for maintaining that asset in a in a manner which allows it to deliver the services it needs. So in the case we're discussing, like it's got to be a school that's available. That's their risk. If you build the school in the public sector, you still have to maintain the school, and you might still have problems down the line. And you've got to make some allowance for that when you're comparing the two things. So it's those kind of risks that you're trying to build in plus risks around overruns and construction. And like the whole range of other risks there might be in a project. I mean, just to sort of come back to the point that Clive Betts was making a moment ago, like risks around revenue streams, for example, if you're running a leisure centre or a power station or something like that. Private sector can be quite well placed to manage those kinds of risks. It's the sort of thing the private sector does like a lot of. And in those sorts of circumstances, you might have more of a case for using private finance. The government's not doing PFI. Discontinued it in 2018, partly because of an assessment of whether it was value for money to transfer risk in the way that PFI was doing at the time, considering all of these sorts of things and the lessons that we've learned so far.
Bring you in, David Lunn, if I may, please, on two different points. Firstly, surely what we ought to be doing in taking this the dialogue we've just had into account is to try and reduce risk. And if you started going down the line that the NHSE has been going down of producing standard designs for hospitals 2.0, and presumably the same thing could be done for schools, you not only get the optimum design, having discussed it with the medics or the teachers or whoever, presumably you can build in best practice to stop all these roofs leaking, at least for a considerable period of time, and light bulbs going and so on, and make them easier to fix when they do go. What work is the Treasury doing to reduce risk in these contracts?
Absolutely. So I should also let Matthew give a view here, because I'm sure he will have strong views. But there are a number of examples of where that's happening. I think if you were to look at the prison program at the moment, it's a very similar thing: standardised contract form, standardised design, and my understanding is that that's working very effectively as it stands at the moment. And it's a really good example of lesson learned from the earlier sort of PFI program, and even within the PFI family, if you like. I think PF2 in its later stages was moving in that direction, and that technology is not specific to PFI. It's something that you can use in any world. If you have a program of projects going forward, if you can standardise it, you should standardise it. I think you need to understand that there may be shortfalls around that as well, because it might mean that you end up giving everybody a sort of a cooker cutter building when they may have sort of good reasons for a little bit more flexibility. So you do need to lay those trade-offs against one another. But in principle, absolutely would agree. If you can run it as a programme, you should, and if you can standardise, you should.
A completely different point, but and it might be you, David, it might be Matthew. I want to take you to paragraph 4.17 on page 32 in the report, and it says around 1/4 of respondents from central government and local bodies, including the NHS, to a survey stated that contract did not contain any information on how and in what condition assets should be returned. Poorly drafted clauses open to interpretation, resulting in differing views between authorities and PFI providers. Isn't this a lesson that we've really got to learn, that the clauses within whatever agreement, whatever way you're going to finance it, have got to be absolutely crystal clear so that it's fully understand at the outset who is taking on what risk and what responsibility?
Again, would absolutely agree, and I will let Matthew come in, but I think that part of the answer here is it depends at the stage of the programme which you're looking at. And the early contracts, those going back to the 90s and early 2000s, were much less clear in this area than some of the later contracts. And again, Matthew may want to.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree. I mean, I would be I'm sure it was a standardisation of contracts, which became known as SOPC 4, and it was a 4A. So the final version, that absolutely had handback provisions in the contract. So there was an evolution. Our problem is what we're dealing with now is the pre-standardisation contracts, which were done in the late 90s, now maturing 30 years later, and are very weak in that regard.
Going back to your MOT, that we were talking about 3 and 5 year MOTs, where the provisions not clear, how are you advising the public sector body that's having to deal with this matter?
One of the things with our asset condition playbook, we've actually worked with the private sector to say, whatever the contract says, we know you are responsible for maintaining this asset. So from an availability point of view, if it's not well maintained, you're not doing your PPN, so your pre-planned maintenance regime, you are going to have availability problems. We would like to have a transparent approach to expiry such that you prepare through a survey to say, well, actually, we are maintaining the assets, and therefore we don't have adversarial situations where we have to withhold payments because we're comfortable they are doing the work.
David.
And Matthew, I think the argument would be that it's actually in their interest for transparency around the end of life and handback, as well as the public sector.
Yes, no surprises to both sides is the ideal situation to be in. And they are cooperating with that process. Inevitably, when there's a complicated contract, people will look at the contract. The early versions are not as good as the later ones, for sure, which is perhaps where the interview results are coming from.
Interesting, thank you very much. Oliver.
Thank you, Chair. Just as an interesting stat on that, I was reading some of the old correspondence, I think, from previous reports of this committee, and Matthew, you sent this committee a letter in 2021, in response, I think probably in a different hat, around the 52% of projects that were ready for expiry at that point were rated amber or worse in terms of its kind of readiness to be handed over to the public sector. And I think that probably speaks to the points that the Chair has raised. But on to my questions, which I have to say is a little bit surreal for me, as somebody whose school was rebuilt in a PFI, and one of you probably signed it off over the last 20 years.
We have to be me.
We'll leave that for another day. We're on lessons learned. I don't want this to be like a bit of a gripe session. I think Conrad, you
well, you've done. We're not here to cheerlead for the private finance initiative.
No. Conrad, you mentioned before about lessons being learned from this. So, what measures are in place to prevent accounting classifications unduly influencing the reason for going into PFI PPP contracts in future?
A few things to say on this. The first is that the guidance on how to choose is crystal clear. That accounting treatment is not a reason to choose to go to pursue private finance. And you can see that guidance is being followed because a number of the recent uses of private finance in the public sector are on balance sheet, as I think James was mentioning a moment ago. Sizewell C, we're expecting to be on balance sheet. A series of the CCUS things are expected to be on balance sheet. Secondly, the on balance sheet and off balance sheet needs to be assessed with respect to a kind of independent set of standards. And unfortunately and confusingly, in the public sector, there are a number of standards, but for the whole of government accounts, for departmental accounts, and for departmental budgets, we use the International Financial Reporting Standard, which puts most of these things on balance sheet anyway.
This brings me to a second question. Okay. if you could, I know you're in the middle of it, and I don't want to kind of jump the gun, I suppose. But perhaps Mr. Bowley, you might want to come as well. But from what I understand, the NEA report makes clear is that the national accounts don't include the sort of exposure, if you like, to these off-on balance sheet arrangements. But we do use, as you say, the International Financial Reporting Standards for kind of standard accountancy practices. Yeah. Why is that? And is that? Because it doesn't feel very transparent.
So the national accounts have to be drawn up
using internationally comparable standards, and what they use is the European System of Accounts 2010. So when you're producing national accounts, you need to be able to say, this is the UK level of debt, this is the French level of debt, this is the German level of debt, or using a comparable measure. And so that's why they are following ESA 10, and it's obviously the independent ONS that produces those accounts. So we don't produce those accounts. In this circumstance, what's important is to be completely transparent about what is going on, which is why we have the IFS reporting in WJ and departmental accounts. We have a reconciliation between that and national accounts, and we have the extra transparency around the future unitary charge payments under those old PFI contracts that Matthew was referring to a while ago. So try and be follow the international standards, but be as transparent as possible. And in your decision making, base it on value for money, not accounting.
Oh, thank you. On the value for money element, I suppose this is kind of the £billion question. Literally. And Mr. Bowler, you said at the start that the classification is not an aim, it's the value for money, which is good because this committee this is what we're interested in. The NAO mentioned that there's an obvious problem with sort of shifting the immediate cost, if you like, to build some of these things to the long-term costs of upkeep. And this phrase around a sort of fiscal illusion, and that the eventual costs of dealing with these assets when they're handed back to the public sector are not necessarily accounted for. I don't really want to get into a big political conversation about the Green Book, but do you feel like the systems that are currently set up are adequate for judging long-term value for money, specifically in relation to sort of new public-private finance partnerships? Because looking at it from the outside, it feels to me that some of these much longer-term assessments that we're making now around upkeep or the cost of handback or whatever, that these don't feel like value for money for the public.
I mean, it's probably worth saying, because I don't know whether it's come across, that these are the NAO report, which is excellent, looks primarily at private finance initiative, as was done, and that changed over the while, and that has ceased the way of doing that ceased in 2018. So obviously the first thing you would do is not do things as you did before and learn the lessons, and obviously by not doing things the way we did things before, that's been there. I would say it is the case that there is that people tend to look at the shorter term set of numbers in the coming years rather than the longer term thing. Transparency is, I think, the answer to that. And to try and be clear, we published all the PPP liabilities in accounts and the whole of government accounts, of which this committee is a huge supporter of. We publish all the annual unitary charges, and we publish equity returns for PF2, and we're also committing, and I think this is a major change, to publishing business cases for major projects. So we can tell you we've followed the Green Book and all the things, but other people will be able to do that. So sort of the light of transparency, I think is the answer. And you can see from all the lessons learnt here that we're setting up the processes to make it very clear that we're not just sort of chasing a classification style decision. It is the case that accounts are measured in different ways for different things, which is slightly beyond our control. I would just come back to where we started, actually. The case for saying yes or no to a project is about value for money and the best way of doing it and the outcomes you're trying to deliver. So we're not doing PFI as we used to do it. We are still using private finance, and we're using it now, and it's often on balance sheet, Sizewell C. So we're using it very explicitly, often in a regulatory asset-based model in Sizewell C, for example, to say that we actively think the construction costs will be lower by bringing in that sharp overview of what we're doing, that things wouldn't have gone ahead Thames Tide Rate at a cost that would be manageable unless we took on some of those extreme risks. And you're also seeing in how we're trying to crowd in private finance that we've got these expert bodies like the National Wealth Fund now that are taking equity and loans, not just giving government grants, to say that, well, if this project is a success, the government shares in that success, but it's making investments that wouldn't go ahead in an acceptable way without them. So things have moved on quite a lot from the PFI of the 90s, and perhaps we haven't made that clear enough. I hope that helps.
No, that is helpful. I suppose just into current day though, I guess. So the NO report talks about out of the government's 108 most complex and strategically significant projects in its government major projects portfolio, only 9 were evaluated robustly, with 77 had no evaluation agreements. So I kind of put it to you, I suppose, that there has probably been a political decision made at some stage, which is to say, okay, we recognise these things probably don't represent long-term best value for money, but they do deliver projects now, and they do allow spades to be put in the ground today. It's that sort of political short-termism, but it leads to a lack of value for money in the longer term, which is where we're sat 20 years later, believing that. Does that sound accurate to you?
Well, the evaluation point is... the evaluation point is deeply unacceptable of 8% of 100 and plus things, and that is why, and as you pointed out, it's not... Our predecessors and ourselves have been sitting in front of you for 20 plus years on this issue with 100 and so many reports. So there's been essentially, and I think it is in the report, at the initiation of private finance, people were talking about it being self-monitoring, and that clearly has not proved to be the case. Huge contract management is required, hence what we've had to set up. But on the evaluation front, I'll bring Smewing in if I may. We've been on a long programme to basically get that in a significantly better place. I think Conrad can correct me, but we're at over 60% now of major projects with high quality evaluation in place, and we want to go a lot further with an action plan to deliver. I don't know whether I've left you any meat on the bone there, Conrad.
Well, no, I mean, so that 8% figure came from some work that we did internally on the GMPP some years ago, 2021, or maybe a bit earlier, maybe 2019, as part of work that we're doing to try and improve and increase the amount of valuation across government, and that GMPP part of it we saw as a sort of serious lacuna, and so we've been on a several-year project working with first the IPA and now NISTA to ensure that the number of robust evaluation plans in these projects goes up and has increased. The 63% number which James just quoted is 63% of a much larger GMPP as well. So the size of the GMPP has increased over that time. So we're quite... Well, I'm pleased that we've got that far. I still don't think that is enough. Is it right that 40% of these projects don't have an evaluation plan? No, I don't think it is. There's still more to do, and there's the evaluation task force have a kind of action plan to keep pushing that number up. I guess we agree that was too low. We've been doing our level best to get it up.
That's the sort of macro, I suppose, and thank you for that answer. On the micro level, if I can take you down to the value for money point, when I'm now speaking in 2025 to local authority that manages schools or the health trust or anybody that's had some kind of PFI, PPP arrangement over the last 20, 30 years, they're all telling me they now haven't got the revenue to deal with the contract that they're dealing with. Is that taken into account when you're looking at these assessments and evaluations at a later stage?
So there's certainly an issue of one difference between these old PFI contracts and publicly procured things at the time is that the sort of implicit interest costs of assets that were built using public finance in the past, those don't fall on the budgets of the school or the hospital trust. concerned, whereas these PFI unitary charge payments are doing. Obviously, those trusts and schools have kind of had to find the money to pay those unitary charges from the beginning of the contract when it was available. So it's not a kind of new thing, but these things are creating less flexibility in the budgets of the public authorities concerned. You sort of don't escape that lack of inflexibility. It's just held in a different part of the public finances if you're doing the public financing. So we've got a kind of we've got to pay debt interest on all of the gilts sold for the ordinary capital. So the inflexibility is sort of there wherever where you're doing capital finance, and you've got to find a way of managing it. But it's certainly an issue that we take into account when we're setting budgets for revenue budgets in spending reviews going forward.
Okay, thank you. Last one from me, Chair, if I can, very quickly. When you, or when predecessors were sat in front of this committee in 2018 talking about a similar sort of review of PFI, there was a debate had about benefits data and whether the benefits data was collected and whether it was adequate. And for new PFI, are you intending to, or PPP, whatever you want to call it, of that kind of class, are you intending to do that as you go now instead of trying to capture it later, the benefits data? And to sort of jimmy on the last bit of a question to that, because it's my last one, do you feel like the value for money judgments that are being made over the longer term, 20, 30, 40 year period, are robust enough to assure us and the taxpayers that these are value for money for the longer term?
So a few things there. I mean, firstly, I think that the models we now have in place to use private finance learn the very hard lessons of the 25 years as much as possible. I'm sure there'll unfortunately be exceptions. So we're in a better place and a better understanding to do that. And these are run by much more highly skilled people who've sort of learned those lessons. So I think that's point one. Point two, I think you're right, and the report points to it. You asked the IPA, as was, I think in 2020, to deliver the data on the benefits, and they had a go on it, and they might have to, NISTA colleagues might have to speak for themselves, but I think they found that the data just wasn't available with the private what the private sector have done and what the public comparator would have been, and they tried and didn't get there. So the outcome then is that we absolutely do make sure that that's available going forward. And then just because it's your last question, I mean, I think that it's worth saying we're giving you detailed answers. I mean, it's notable and worth saying that obviously in 2018, with all the issues around private finance, the decision was taken not to carry on doing it as it had been doing, which I guess, if we haven't said that, covers some of the basis. But do you want to say any more about the data? I don't know whether I've answered your question.
No, well, I think certainly we absolutely agree with you if anything were to be done moving forward. What we have got is a huge now amount of lessons learned, and I referred to the data focus with our programme. So we are building up more and more data around performance and ensuring that we can learn the lessons. For in-flight delivery, future expiries, or for application to other sectors. We've talked about the energy transition. They are related, renewables, etc.
Great. I really hope so. I'll not get into a sort of a soapbox about the Green Book now, but we'll do it another day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. On sort of Oliver's theme, really, about getting best value for money permanent secretary, I was shocked, or the committee was shocked, when we had a hearing on carbon capture and storage, which the government's committed a staggering £22 billion over 25 years. When we asked the department whether they thought about how they might get a return from any of that money, they hadn't even thought about it. Now, if you were a venture capital fund, putting money into a project that had an uncertain outcome, an uncertain timetable, and an uncertain cost, which is what this is, you'd certainly want to be building clauses into those contracts that if it worked, taxpayer would get some of that money, seed corn money, or a venture capital fund. You put that seed corn money in, you'd either expect to have a quite considerable equity stake in that project or some profit sharing agreement when it did come into success and profits started flowing to the private sector. Why shouldn't they flow to the public sector as well?
I did see that, and I saw the committee's response. And I mean, the thing I would say, which probably doesn't wholly answer your question, Chair, but the very nature of the regulatory asset-based model that they are pursuing there means that, in this case, the regulator, Ofgem, will regulate the return that the private sector is getting. So I think that might go some way to say that the return can't just be sort of exponential and entirely one way. And if it does really well, the benefit would be in essentially lower prices for the consumer. And I don't know whether my colleagues said that to you in the committee. There you go. But that would be my understanding of the regulatory asset model, and that's why that model has more checks and balances in it than just if you wrote a contract and said you get the upside, unspecified. Do you want to come in on that?
I mean, so that is also that's also my understanding of the CTUS design. Although I'm not an expert on it, I guess I would say more broadly that one of the impacts of the move to public sector net financial liabilities rather than public sector net debt for the fiscal rule, allowing an expanded role for the public for things like the National Wealth Fund investing alongside private investors. That is something that previously would have been difficult under the old framework, which didn't make a good distinction between the sort of venture capital, equity investment or lending that you're talking about and just granting the money. So the incentives are there to do it if it worked well in the project. I don't know enough about the detail of the project, whether there is actually a kind of, given the regulatory asset-based model, it would make sense in CCUS. But in other areas, you could certainly do something like that. I know the National Wealth Fund do invest alongside private investors in a number of these emerging technology sectors.
So I think that's a very helpful answer, but I think what we're asking, Permanent Secretary, is when these big projects are designed, particularly they are uncertain outcome and uncertain technology that the Treasury will look at, how the taxpayer might get a return if it goes better than expected and produces profits quicker.
No, and that very much the case, and indeed we will expect both. One of NISTA's new roles will be to examine big major projects before they even come to the Treasury for sign-off. And, this committee has repeatedly pointed out, to build on Mr. Smewing's point, that, are we giving grants when we could be taking equity, we could be taking loans, and the move in the fiscal rule and the existence of things like the National Wealth Fund are to try and do just that, to recognise there was no incentive under public sector net debt. A grant counted the same as a loan, counted the same as an equity share. Now the financial asset you create is also on there as well as the liability. So there's an incentive in the thing. So we're trying to get a system that works better. On major projects, absolutely it is the case that we need to look at the, so-called gain share as well as that. And there are projects which I think are referenced in the report that have done that. I think Hinkley Point C and the dispatchable power agreement in Teesside, but I think we absolutely should be looking to that, because it's an uncertain world, so you need to prepare for eventualities, including upside.
Very helpful, Permanent Secretary. Thank you. Sorry, Matthew.
Well, I was just going to say we absolutely did talk in detail with DESNZ throughout the 18-month construction of both the transportation and storage companies and also the dispatchable power agreement, super profits, refinancing benefits, which the NAO previously. We have a checklist of these things, we came to a balanced solution. I'd say your 22 billion investment is slightly different. That's actually the revenue stream, both from consumers and also taxpayers. That's different from the 9 billion that's going into the Teesside projects and the 4.5 billion going into HyNet. So you're slightly not comparing apples and apples there, you're comparing apples and pears. But happy to kind of frankly go through that in more detail, and also the...
I'm going to argue with an expert, but that's my understanding of the situation. But anyway.
I don't want to give you the impression that absolutely we went through striking the right balance between upside returns and getting the best outturn for consumers and taxpayers.
Okay, thank you very much. Bobby Dean, please.
Thanks. I'm going to move on a little bit to sort of looking forward to the future and adopting sort of commercial strategies. In the report, we saw a lot of evidence about the sort of lengthy and fragmented procurement process putting off or maybe driving up the cost of some of the contracts in the past. And so I guess I want to know a little bit about the lessons learned from that today, and perhaps it's for you, David Lunn, to explain the lessons learned on that front and how we can make sure that when we're going to that market that the procurement is kind of efficient and competitive.
I can do my best. So I think part of the answer actually comes back to the standardised contracts and the earlier set of questions. So the more you can have a programme of projects which follow a similar path and have a similar contractual form, then that should help smooth and ease and quicken the procurement process. So I think that's part of the answer. You can't do that in every circumstance. I think particularly as you get to the bigger projects, they become more bespoke and more unique, and there's more sort of complexity that you need to work through. But where you can do that, you absolutely should. I think actually it's not always procurement as well. There are other things going on which can drag these things out. So in particular, planning is often an issue, particularly on these bigger projects. And some of the planning reforms which are going through will hopefully help there in a way which will also allow you to move sort of more quickly through the procurement structures as well. So it's not just sort of procurement narrowly. It is a wider environment of project that you need to work within. And I think there is something around sort of engagement with sort of bidders or potential investors at as early a stage as possible, so you don't sort of fully cook the scheme before you go out to the market. You talk to them early, you take advantage of the lessons learned that you have through those conversations, so that when you do go, it's more likely to sort of be able to move through the process quickly. But again, I should sort of turn around and see if others would want to add to that question.
Yeah, no, I mean, one, I think your question is an excellent question. Bidder fatigue, especially when people don't feel that a process is moving at pace and that the work that they're doing, time is money, ultimately. David's point about front-ending the risk allocation, identifying the risks which are really, we've talked about those risks which are high impact, low probability, very difficult to predict and price. If you can take those, put them to one side, work on the design and work with bidders to move at pace. There was some success in the PF2 programme. DfE had a centralised team that didn't work with local authorities but actually had a model form contract, worked at pace, and it got done within 18 months. Bid processes of 2 years and beyond, you just end up with bidder fatigue and everybody loses interest and focus.
And maybe it's going back to a point we made earlier again about pipeline. You may be prepared to do this procedurally, but if you haven't got a government that's got certainty about which projects it's committed to and when, and we heard earlier from the investors about needing a long, thin pipeline that's got certainty in it. Is that something that we need to hear from, I guess, government directive this summer? This is the pipeline, this is the certainty, in order to be able to deliver that.
Absolutely would agree with that. It's not just about the format or the website, it's about what's in. The more important thing is what's the information in the pipeline and the flow of projects coming through. And the aim and the ambition is definitely for that pipeline to be, these are things that are going to happen. We've got certainty on this. If we haven't got certainty, be clear where we haven't got it and when we would expect to get it. And then you might want words around it saying these are the things that we're thinking about, and these are other projects that we have in development, but they're not yet at the stage where they're sufficiently committed that they could make their way into the pipeline, and we don't yet have a full range of detail, which is why, as Jean-Christophe said earlier, both the projects within the pipeline will develop over time, and every 6 months, at least initially, that will be the expectation of when it's updated, but also the pipeline itself and the types of information that you would look to include in there is something that too will need to develop, and we'll talk to sort of investors, and we'll talk to the market, get feedback on what information they would find helpful, and then look to develop the tool itself over time as well. So this summer will be the start of the process rather than the final end game, I think.
And at the start of this process, it seems to me it's just as important that they're clear on what's out and when it might come in, rather than just saying this is what's in at this time.
Yeah, and it has to be a conversation, doesn't it? And
then moving on to the sort of kind of monitoring of the projects, we've discussed how self-monitoring basically didn't work as far as we're concerned, and so we're going to have a much more active public sector, I guess, in terms of the monitoring of the contracts going forward. How ready do we feel for that? Do we have the skills in place already, or is that something that we still have capacity gaps on? I don't know if it's for you, Matthew, Vickerstaff, on this. Are we sort of shovel ready to get going with the long thin pipeline projects that investors are waiting on?
Well, I think one of the questions, and we have been doing more than research in this area, actually implementing and building up, is using. There's a tendency to use kind of AI technologies, more machine learning, to actually take contracts and actually download them so that one has the contracts, and then one can use machine learning tools to actually review, especially around performance, underlying contracts. And there are now bits of software and skills and capability that can allow you, from a contract management point of view, to vastly improve your knowledge of your contracts, how you monitor them, and also, as I mentioned earlier, building information systems, and also the technology from a self-diagnosis perspective, how the building is working, from an asset management point of view, can spew out performance and payment data that you need to make. So there is actually a huge amount that we've been thinking about. And if that could have been specified up front in some of these PFI contracts, albeit 25, 30 years ago, there has been somewhat of a paradigm shift around that contract management, the expertise, the technology that could be deployed.
Could I maybe just add two other elements in the skills, which I think you were asking about, both skills within government and then the skills in the sectors that need to build and supply the services, and in a sense NISTA has an important role in both of those. So NISTA will it's going to involve some change, but one of the things it needs to continue doing is being the home, as the IPA was for the government's project function and professionalism. There are 26,000 project professionals in government, and the project function dates back to about 10 years ago, and there is still some way to go to improve skills across government, and that is going to be an extremely important role for NISTA to continue. And then there's do the sectors, construction, etc., have the appropriate skills and workforces, and there NISTA, in collaboration with Department for Business, DFE, has a role in supplying the information. Again, it comes back to the pipeline and the 10-year strategy that organisations such as Skills England will use to try and identify what the long-term skills needs for the UK are over 10, 15, 20 years, in order to ensure that the infrastructure projects and the like can be delivered. So those are two other skills-related elements that I thought I'd mention, and I dare say the committee will come back to how NISTA is doing on those in the years to come.
Definitely wants to come in. I'll do it for after.
So just to add very quickly, if you talk to the construction industry and suppliers, they will tell you that the pipeline is directly sort of one of the things that they would look to as well, as they think about their schools and look at their internal apprenticeship programs and all of those things. So there's multiple uses.
Yeah, I guess part of the reason behind my question as well is not just about the availability of skills full stop, but also who holds them and who drives that kind of accountability process for the project as well, because we've heard in the past about how certain contracting authorities won't even have anybody whose full-time duty is to monitor the contract, and they're kind of relying on their relationship with the contractor, and then in turn those people might actually be having various subcontracted arrangements, and actually there's not enough people on the sort of public sector side whose sole focus is to drive forward the delivery of the contracts in the way they want it to. So not just sort of more broadly, but do you feel that lesson has been learned, that we know that we feel like the public sector needs to have a more direct grip over project delivery rather than relying on external consultants or subcontractors? Do you think that's an issue?
I mean, I would say there's a shortage of skills in the public sector, but also in the private sector as well. And the fragmented way that these projects, certainly in the PFI world, are managed, that you have a special purpose vehicle that contracts out, subcontracts to facilities management companies, and uses also a management support arrangement as well, means that it's very fragmented. So absolutely, having more skills and capability and not having subcontracting arrangements where there is interface issues, and I hate to say it, finger pointing, that's your fault, not ours, is a very good way to, I think about the way forward.
When you say the availability of skills, is that just simply we don't have enough trained, or is it that they're working elsewhere in other European countries, for instance, driving forward their projects instead? Like, does the UK have the skill set available? Could we attract them back into UK projects? Do they exist?
I'm confident they could be attracted. Again, if there's the pipeline there, people will say, okay, I need a bid team, I need a contract management team, I need to assemble a team to actually bid on that pipeline. There are projects happening in Europe and internationally, for sure, which have attracted some of the talent away. Saudi is a big problem at the moment, but perhaps that's going to suppress a bit as they have their financial problems with the oil price. So if you're on LinkedIn at the moment, infrastructure specialists are in high demand globally.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Bobby. Can I just follow up those questions? I mean, both of you, Matthew and Jean-Christophe, said you'll be involved in managing the end state of existing contracts. Will you be involved at the beginning state, particularly the big ones, and particularly the novel ones?
Absolutely. So that is front-end loading of contracts is what NISTA will be all about. You've got to get involved at the front end, and actually the CST is absolutely keen that he gets an early sight from an approval process on the process on big projects, the most complicated ones in government.
Yeah, and to build on that, we are currently working with the government commercial function and actually the Office of Value for Money, which is going to make some recommendations to government about mega projects and exactly the best way of ensuring success in those, and we will draw on both of those areas of expertise as we develop a new approvals process at the front end.
Thank you very much. Clive Betts, please.
Right, just going on from those comments. So, looking now at winding up, ending PFI contracts that have been in place for quite some time now, is one of the real problems about the fact they were set up with very little oversight on a contract compliance oversight basis from the customer. A real difficulty when it comes to ending the contracts, and the customer doesn't really know what they've got because they've not been looking at it in detail for a long period of time.
That is absolutely the case in some cases, for sure. It actually speaks directly to what Matthew was saying earlier about the exit health checks at 7, 5, and 3. Yeah. And central to that is trying to help the contracting authorities better understand and plan for example, the asset condition that they will that will be returned to them.
So, and there are a number of modules of that, and you might be, given your questioning, you might be interested to hear the first module is understanding your contract. The first question we ask is, have you got it? Have you actually got your contract? It might sound odd, but actually these projects sometimes were done 10 to 15 years ago. There might be a Bible from a law firm, but they might not have been updated to take into account variations that have occurred over that period. We then ask, have you read it? Which is what the contract management software we talked about is becoming, I think, a really useful tool. We'll then ask, have you got your financial model? So again, That's 7 years out. There's an information gathering exercise, which is absolutely critical, and then we'll go on to governance, relationships, commercial strategy, and also future services. What are your plans? But you are, I mean, I hate to say it, you are right. They won't always have everything that they need, which is why we need to go so early.
Right, so what can you do to help local authorities, health trusts and others? Given, one of the problems that I experience with PFI contracts is literally the local authority denuded itself of the expertise and capabilities to actually look at these issues and understand them. So they're going to need help. Sure.
So training, we have training programs, online, in person, assisted. We have help desks afterwards. Did there any questions? We run network sessions. So actually we get the same people together in the room, and so that they talk about what they're doing in terms of managing their contracts, the issues that they're finding. And also we work extremely closely with departments to make sure the support they're giving to local authorities, NHS trusts, is also targeted and is enabling and helpful. There's a lot more, frankly. Guidance, we have learned since 2018, guidance is all very well, but actually toolkits and helpful ways of assessing what you've got and then doing and actually taking action is a lot better than, let's say, a 40-page document which sets out what your guidance should be. It really should be toolkits to help actual contract practitioners.
And is it worth giving an example, perhaps, of the very practical impact where we've had some challenges like that? And I mean, if I may, I'll pick an example which has been, I think, very controversial and understandably so, and very problematic, and has had quite a lot of media attention around schools in the Stoke area and the like. Actually, I'm slightly stealing your thunder. Matthew's been directly involved in that, but one of the consequences of that so far, and there is a way to go, is that working with the private sector provider, that provider has had to set aside, or has agreed to set aside, multi-million pounds, 30 million pound asset improvement, asset condition improvement fund, and that is as a direct result, largely driven by the contracting authority, but with involvement from IPA as part of that on the shoulder. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, exactly that. That started about 2.5 years ago, actually going to Stoke Town Hall, sitting down with the CEO and just flagging that there's real problems here and strategy needs to be put in place to actually manage this contract out. To be fair to him, he made himself the senior responsible owner for that contract and has really rolled up his sleeves and got involved.
Right. And you can do that with any sort of contract.
I can talk to you about satellites which are expiring with the MOD, heavy equipment transporters, field equipment, power supplies which are taken round, as well as police stations, courts, street lighting, water projects, waste projects. Very happy to discuss all the work that we're doing across all of those sectors.
In terms of local authorities who are obviously very hard up for cash, are you charging for your work?
We have a special arrangement with MHCLG, so that department has provided support to provide that contract support for local authorities, and that will continue this year as well.
So individual authorities are not paying for it?
No, they only where we are not in the business of resource substitution. So generally we are providing support, but sometimes local authorities are willing to pay for it as well.
That seems a rather vague answer.
Well, it's purposefully so, because we don't want to create the moral hazard of everybody queuing up. We have to go through an appraisal process to say, can we provide the support? Do we think the support is really impactful, and do we think the local authority is doing everything they should do to warrant the support? What we haven't done, because we think it's problematic, is said, here's a budget, everybody put together business cases, etc. We know the projects well enough, and also the investors, the FM companies, and the situation so that we can lean in, provide that real support. So the associate pool I mentioned, the 60 associates, really is how we provide the support directly to the local authorities. We're not giving them money, we're actually giving them resource support.
Matthew, just on that Stoke-on-Trent, we've got a long brief on this. Are you reasonably confident that schools will get a satisfactory outcome at the end of the day?
We are confident. There is a certain amount of academy trusts. There's 88 schools. I referred earlier to some of them should never have been in the programme because they were old Victorian schools that had big latent defects which were taken on by the local authority. That's where the interface problematic issues have been. There's a £3.5 million payment that the local authority is looking to make to address some issues which are, shall we say, quite contentious and potentially could result in legal action. But the 30 million has been provided by Innisfree, the investor, in the underlying project company.
That's really helpful.
We're actually almost at the end of that process. To be fair to the investor, they have agreed to go beyond the final date of the contract to finish off some of the works. So they have been cooperative. As I say, there's lots of parties involved, and that's why there's some quite noisy press around that project.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Michael Payne, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the well-rehearsed point about the inevitable potential, sometimes failure of the private sector to deliver public infrastructure projects, we all remember the incident with Carillion, and in particular the NAO report in 2020 highlighted that your own department, Permanent Secretary, the Treasury had to step in, the Cabinet Office had to step in, the Department for Health and Social Care and I think NHS Improvement all had to step in with public funds to complete 2 hospital projects which Carillion had started but could not complete after it went into liquidation. The current NEO report draws attention to ISG Limited, which was obviously a public sector construction, helping the public sector construction company, government supplier, which went into administration in September 2024. So 2 questions I've made, one to you, Permanent Secretary, and a follow-up question to Mr. Smewing. The question to you, Permanent Secretary, is how do you support departments, government departments, to prepare for and manage potential supplier failure? And a question to Mr. Smewing, a follow-on question to that. What contingency plans are in place to address supplier failures, particularly for critical services, in order to avoid over-reliance on government support?
So, perfectly reasonable question. And at the start of this session, I listed being ready for failure as one of the lessons learnt. And certainly there was a lot of lessons learnt out of Carillion that the NAO and government pointed to. So to answer your question directly, I think some of the lessons involve so-called living wills. So that would be that this company provided a whole set of services that risk stopping and therefore leaving, is everything from, if memory serves, school dinners to prisons providers and all sorts. So there's a whole lesson in living wills so that you have in your contract from the outset what happened, that those services will continue. There's a second lesson which you talked about more generally, that departments need contingency plans for all of these things. And we've published 4 playbooks by sector, 12 guidance notes and a sourcing playbook which includes some of the resolution plans on this. You also talked about the projects they were building, a construction phase, and there's absolutely the need for termination provisions that are clear and reflect the reality that lenders are unlikely to step in halfway through these construction projects, which is another lesson learnt out of Carillion. And the need to monitor and have indicators of distress through them. And all of those things might be relevant to how you structure a project overall and whether you give one provider so much provision. I think I would, before I hand over to Mr. Smewing, say that by the time that ISG happened, was it 3 years later, the lessons I think we did learn from Carillion meant had been implemented and mitigated quite a lot of what would have been significant impacts from recent supplier behaviour. And by the way, I just add one thing that I know this committee has been important on that we've also looked at, which is making sure that companies pay their subcontractors promptly, because that was another issue that came out of Carillion, because it was their supply base were unpaid. I'm happy to come back to more failures, but I don't know whether you want to take on.
Well, I don't know if there's that much more that I can add to that answer. I mean, post Carillion, the guidance and the sourcing playbook that James was referring to, like, requires people to think much more carefully about exactly those contingency plans. You know, call it living wills or call it whatever you like. Both monitoring of the financial health of your counterparties, and then what you do if they do get into financial distress, like much more rigour around like planning ahead for that. I think the sort of reference to ISG Limited in the NAO report sort of is an indication that has worked. I mean, I don't think ISG was quite on the same scale as Carillion, but you know, it is at least. I'd much rather have that indication that it was working than that it was not working. I guess. So yeah, that's what I'd say on that.
Thank you. Just on the drawing from the point about ISG, perhaps a question for Mr. Vickerstaff, but Permanent Secretary, you may want to also add something. Getting ahead of the risk, what mechanisms are in place to ensure that government avoids contracting with companies that are at risk of administration? And then perhaps as a follow-on, and I think you've touched on this a little bit, Mr. Vickerstaff, but how are you sharing knowledge of supplier and project performance across departments and other public authorities to learn from that?
So I'd just say on ISG, government commercial function, having been through Carillion, really had got a very smooth management plan. The markets and supplies team did a superb job. You can take this two ways. The other interesting thing about ISG, the problems were with its private sector clients. That actually caused the public the problems from their financial position. The public sector contracts were seen as profitable. Now, you might say, well, is that actually bad because there was a way for contractors to step in, but they were being paid a reasonable return, and we want to make sure that's the case. So actually, we're getting something right there about contract management, about setting and calibrating the profitability right, but also our fallback plans as well. So government commercial function, Crown reps we work with when we have problems. I referred to some of the construction issues with contractors. We work with the Crown rep, but absolutely we work across departments, especially DFE and DHSC, to actually manage the relationships both with the contracting community but the FM community as well. Because this is a whole of government thing. We should be taking a strategic approach to managing all of these contracts and making sure the problems can be addressed across Whitehall from a Whitehall perspective.
The only thing I'd add is it is absolutely the case that we do far more enhanced supplier monitoring with indicators of distress and improved contract writing, which would include the health of the bidder in the first place for a contract, but then also through the life of a contract, any indicators of distress, trying to get well ahead of an administration or a bankruptcy.
You're confident, Permanent Secretary, just to pick up on Mr. Vickerstaff's point, that knowledge, if you like, that monitoring is being shared broadly across the whole of government, accepting this is not just a responsibility that falls on HMT.
Yes, and I'm not confident that no company will ever go bust again, but I am confident that, as Mr. Vickerstaff said, that the commercial function that took through that, which is actually not centred in the Treasury but the Cabinet Office, went through that and learnt those lessons and is applying those. And they have you have a commercial director in every single department that reports into the commercial function, the ability to very quickly spread information and what have you around Whitehall And the Carillion experience was a very, very deep and sobering one for government as a whole, with so much thing that the lessons I think are really well learnt there. And we remain on our guard, and the commercial function, which is a specialist and professional function, is looking at that. So they are engaging much more. They engage already, but they're engaging very regularly with all government suppliers, and I think that is proving to be a better way of going about things.
Thank you, Chair.
In Matthew Vickerstaff's answer, all the actors are involved in this. The one you didn't mention was the regulator. And I'm just wondering whether we should have a change of attitude in the regulators, that they should pay more attention to the strength of balance sheets, particularly in utilities, monopoly utilities, so-called monopoly utility positions. Because after all, when you get a bulb, it always ends up costing the consumer more than if you'd managed to prevent it going into insolvency in the first place.
That's a very topical point on regulators, and have they regulated too much for price in the past and not enough for investment assets and sustainability? There's John Cunliffe's doing a review of the water regulatory system. There's a review underway, I think, in Ofgem, and I gave evidence to you with colleagues from DESNES about bulb, and obviously having to go down the SAR model because the operator of last resort was too large for and too many customers. So there's lessons to learn there. I mean, as it was, as you recall, there was quite a risk on bulb, but partly because of the wholesale price that we bought into. The government made, I think, a £1.5 billion return actually on that investment. So it's not always the case that these interventions lose money for the taxpayer.
Very helpful. Thank you very much. Michael Payne, have you finished?
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can I ask a couple of questions at the end? Have we got to the end? Yes, we have. I'm going to ask anybody who wants to answer it the same question that I asked the previous panel, and was the evidence we'd got from Afintext UK, and it's this whole business about getting people to bid for these, whatever model of public finance we're going to go for, you've got to get people to bid for it. And I think in the past it's been taken too long, it's been too complex, it's been too costly for people to bid for, and they haven't bothered to bid for it. So Afintext UK come up with a few suggestions, and I'd be very grateful to get your observations. It's exactly the same questions I asked the previous panel. They say, mandate digitalised contract repositories and share data access for all new and legacy PPPs, standardise contract metadata, leverage AI-powered analytics for live contract, embed structural collaboration and agile variation process, and build capability gains across the public sector. I mean, do you think there are things there that we could do better to encourage more people to want to bid, keep the cost of contracting down, and therefore hopefully the cost of greater competition, and keeping the cost down?
I mean, my answer would be at a pretty high level, and then colleagues might want to pick up that. I mean, my answer would be certainty and confidence builds a strong competitive bidding process, that investors will have certainty that the UK is going to go along with a consistent and unchanging long-term set of policies, which I think the 10-year investment infrastructure strategy is all about. So I'm sort of answering above those points, really, and say I think that is probably the key driver. That's the thing that's going to get international people going, okay, well, the UK is very serious about this. It's got a 10-year plan. I can see what's in it. It's got the pipeline there. It's got the funding there. It's got its 5-year budgets that it's allocated out. I can see what's happening. And there has been quite a lot of chopping and changing in the past. So I'm answering they didn't say that to you, but I would say that would be my prerequisite, to be honest.
Very helpful.
I think many of the things you mentioned are categorically what we intend to do, but
I would just say other suppliers apart from Infinitex are available. so there are other suppliers, but I know who we are talking to them especially
wasn't
about
any
that.
special pleading on behalf of Avintech. It's just that they happen to give us that evidence.
In reality, more seriously, life has moved on. One of the, in terms of some of the things that we have already explored and where we've deployed digital contract management, sometimes it can come with consulting, an offer of consulting services as well. So I think one needs to really define what you actually want and how you're going to utilise it, and also link it very much to asset management. So as I've referred to, in terms of building information services and the way of diagnosing performance, you can link it to the contract. And I think that really is an advance in technology, etc., that is really powerful. But what you've just set out is exactly what I was referring to earlier. It's more machine learning, but I'm sure AI as well is something that is worth thinking about, and we already are.
Does NISTA have modern computer systems, none of these legacy systems that can't cope with the latest AI?
In fact, we're doing, on our analysis of the government's major project portfolio, we're absolutely already using our Scout tool, which is an AI tool, which is helping us as well go through assurance. There's a huge amount of data and information to work through when you carry out an assurance review, and our Scout tool does exactly that, reducing the amount of time that it's required to actually undertake the assurance and making sure you're covering all the information that's provided around the project.
Like to hear you're on it, Mark.
My colleagues in the data area would be really interested in sharing that with you, because they do great work.
Many an offer has been taken up. Many an offer has been taken up. Now, Permanent Secretary, I've got one more question, then Luke Charteris has got a final question. If I could take you to paragraph 3.4 on page 22, and it says this. The Autumn Budget 24 introduced the Financial Transaction Control Framework with the objective of using the principles of the framework to drive value for money by addressing market failures, we've been talking about, securing risk-adjusted returns on investment and economic capital, minimising market distortion, demonstrating additionality, evaluating value for money of alternative options. It does say it's too early to assess whether the government's objective will be met, but clearly you were an integral part of that budget. Yeah. Do you want to say anything about your design of it and how it's working?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked already about the change to the fiscal rules and the investment rule with a net financial debt, so-called PSNUFFLE. And this recognises, unlike public sector net debt, this recognises financial assets as well as financial liabilities. So it is the reason why to treat a grant, a loan and an equity thing differently, because a loan and an equity, you get the public sector gets a return, and that would be scored under this level of thing. So that in and of itself would encourage the take-up of more financial transactions. And so we were very alive, not least because of learning the lessons of actually more so things like guarantees and contingent liabilities that we've had in the past, to say, okay, well, if we're going to say that that's a more mature and better way of measuring financial debt, which will lead to more financial transactions and, hopefully it'll lead to some substitution from grants to loans and equity. But if we're going to get more financial transactions from that, how can we set up a control framework that makes sure we do those well with value for money? So we came up with a set of things, and we've mentioned a few of them, but the set of things would be that we would expect these financial transactions, on balance to get a return greater than the cost of government borrowing. We said that these financial transactions should in the main be done through the brilliantly named PUFINs, the public financial institutions, of which the National Wealth Fund is the one that we've increased the capital, so that it'd be done professionally and at some arm's length, actually, from government to a certain extent. And we've said that we'll report on these financial transactions and the NAO will audit them. so that we're doing sort of fair value and we're not looking away. So the idea is to say, okay, we'll probably be more of these things, but let's set up the control framework from the outset. And obviously much of what we've been saying today has been control frameworks coming in some way down the line on PFI, so we're trying to set it up correctly from the outset. I hope that.
Yeah, no, that's a really helpful answer. Final question from me. I suppose the ultimate test of your success is how much you can shrink that margin between bonds and what the private sector is offering you in terms of finance. Yeah. And that does also depend on you being able to attract international finance as well.
Yes.
How will you measure that?
Well, I think what we've been talking about today is that, the private finance in a project, requires an appropriate return, and if there's not an appropriate return, no one's gonna be interested. But it can't be an excessive return. But more so that from a public sector point of view, whatever return that involves has to involve the better management of a risk than could otherwise be the case, so that the benefits of the cost of doing it that way outweigh the costs, and that's the option that we approve, and an evaluation shows us after the event that was the right thing to do. So I'll come back to where I started, which is there's no sort of one size fits all here. So we're not saying we will only deliver, we're far from saying we'll only deliver an expansion in the schools buildings programme by private finance. We would say you would need to look at the right model based on value for money as to what you should do.
Very helpful. Thank you very much. Luke Jarvis, please.
Thank you. Has the British public sector had too much of an allergic reaction to the use of private finance, particularly for smaller scale projects? And just to give you one example, I met a GP consortium in my constituency, and they've got a healthy balance sheet. They'd love to be able to access private finance, accessing that, but they can't do so because of borrowing constraints. So do you think that because of some of this red tape, that doctors' surgeries in our constituencies aren't getting built?
Shall I pick that up? So I think it comes back to this question of when should you use private finance? You should use it when it's best value for money, and the kind of constraints that are in place sort of across the public sector, which involve putting those kinds of finance leases on balance sheet and scoring them just like any other kind of capital borrowing, I think is what people are talking about there. That gives you a level playing field between going down the private finance route or going down the public finance route, and doing the one that you think is best value rather than the one that looks short-term affordable if you did the private finance off balance sheet. So I think you should look at the affordability and the allocation of public capital in the round, including all of the different options here, and choose the financing route, the financing route only if it is in the long run better for the taxpayer.
Just if I may, just to end on that, I wasn't quite convinced there. For smaller use cases, like GP surgeries, in limited scenarios where there is a viable finance route via the private sector, should red tape really get in the way of building GP surgeries?
I guess I would question whether it is red tape. So it would tend to be the case for smaller projects. One of the costs we didn't talk about in involving private finance is that there tend to be much larger transaction costs because you've got a lot of structuring to do up front. You need to pay the costs of bankers and lawyers and all of that. So it tends to be the case that smaller projects find it harder to pass the VFM angle. So I'm not saying anything about any particular set of projects in general, but in general, you can see from the kind of projects which have been using private finance more recently since PFI was retired, you're talking like £20 billion power stations and big CCUS projects rather than the smaller ones which might be better value directly financed.
In the past, they did the, I hope I get this correct, the so-called LIFTS project, which would have taken vast numbers of GP things all in one project, I think. because of the. It'd be very difficult for a small. I mean, I do think they possibly could get access to their own balance sheet because they're self-employed and it's their.
They report to me that there are borrowing constraints, and I guess the point is
yes,
that there are wider borrowing constraints across the public sector that's blocking outcomes that we all want to see, like GP surgeries being built. So
I wonder, as a helpful suggestion to both of you, whether the NH or the DHSC could put forward a portfolio, because it must be doing quite a lot of doctor surgeries each year, put forward a portfolio and put it into one public or private sector partnership of some form or another.
You could look.
Can I thank our witnesses very much? It's been a long session today, particularly with the panel, but we are very grateful to you. You've been very, very helpful in this quite technical inquiry. An uncorrected version of the hearing will be available in the next few days. We will be producing a report with recommendations, which hopefully you will take some notice of. And so thank you again.